Hello, this is Storybooks channel. New videos are posted every day. Subscribe and click the bell.
The clatter of metal heels echoed down the empty corridor. A young research assistant in a white coat opened the door to the office. It was quite stuffy in here. The bright light of the lamps filled the entire space. Maria turned to the chief scientist. "Is it very stuffy here?" "I will open the window," she said, and then went to the window and opened one sash. The window was small, for the building in which the action was taking place was almost entirely underground. Maria, who was not only the most important, but also the sole instigator here, answered nothing at all. At the moment, she was too much engrossed in her work. Between the two small transparent glasses, there was a drop of green substance. "Maria, can I ask you a question?" Helen, who was at most 19 years old, addressed her again. "Wait," she answered a little more, staring intently with her right eye into the magnifying device, or rather microscope. "Any luck?" she said after a few seconds, which were filled with silence. Maria looked at the girl. She smiled at her. "What do you have there?" she asked immediately. "I wanted to tell you that I watered the plants with the special substance you gave me. I did everything following your instructions," and Maria was eager to hear the result of their experience. "Everything turned out exactly as you suggested." The corners of Helen's lips stretched apart, exposing her small, short teeth. "Really?" Maria couldn't believe her ears. Then she took a step to the side and froze. In her head, she imagined how they would be able to make new discoveries through the study of plants and bring great benefits to people. "It's incredible," she said, turning to her assistant again. "I don't believe it either, but it is. I tortured the wheat grains, put them in a container, and soaked them with water," Helen told me. Her eyes were burning. She wanted to tell it as colorfully as possible. "Then I started to add the purple stuff you gave me to the watering water. And the very next day the grains not only sprouted, but stretched out 7 centimeters. The girl said this phrase with a special intonation. Maria's eyes widened. "Wow, that's great. You are great," she praised her assistant. "What am I? I just have a light hand," replied Helen, a little embarrassed, but at the same time proud of the successful experiment. "Did you bring them with you?" asked Maria, turning the next steps in her head. "Yes, of course, they are in our greenhouse," Helen answered. "Bring them here," rather the scientist told her. "Well," answered the girl, and immediately tapped her heels again. Maria once again nestled into the microscope. Unfortunately, her recent joy was replaced by sadness. The living microorganisms that were in the drop of chlorine between the glasses had died. They were gone. "Why is that? What's wrong?" she said with frustration, her hands at her sides. She began to think about the problem. "What are you missing?" She pondered, and, unnoticed by habit, she gripped her lower lip with her index finger. "What are you in the living leaves? What gives life to these individuals?" Think. What is it?" Maria went to the work table and sat down on a chair and began to rummage through the papers. They were spread out on its surface. She quickly went through the sheets until she found the right one, on which were written some chemical formulas. Her eyes ran over the lines with concentration. The names of the chemical elements and formulas were very clear. But how to keep them in a living leaf in a single drop of juice? Maria tried to find the answer, but nothing came to mind. She leaned back in her chair, laid out her hands on her chest. The girl was already very tired, having spent all morning, all afternoon, and evening in the lab. She wanted to lie down on the bed, but the desire to find the right element outweighed. Maria tried to concentrate, but instead just hovered her gaze at one point. She seemed to fall asleep right with her eyes open. She dreamed as if she were walking amongst huge, tall stalks and overlooked wheat. Her leaves were truly gigantic. Maria trudged through them, looking high into the blue sky. The bright rays of sunlight blinded her. The girl squinted, but continued to stare at the sky as if mesmerized. "Maria! Maria!" Helen called out to her again. Maria opened her eyes and saw, blinded, also the light of the lantern. "Oh, I'm sorry, you fell asleep. The lights are out. We'll have to postpone the experiment," said the assistant. Did I really fall asleep? I didn't believe it. Maria wrinkled from the bright light and wiped her face with the palm of her hand. It's not surprising. You work very hard, Helen said. So what about growth? She asked again. Not everything is back. It's still a micro change, dead, frustrated, and at the same time indifferent, said Maria. She then got up from her chair and found her flashlight. After waiting for Helen to help with the microscope classes and pick up her notebook, she locked the door. The two lab members went home. The next day, Maria had no sooner woken up than she was already running back to her workplace. Her thirst to find the right answer kept her on her toes. Maria, come back. Her mother's voice sounded. Come back and eat your oatmeal. She spoke in a stern and demanding tone. But Mom tried to object. Come back and have a normal breakfast. I need you healthy and full of strength. Otherwise, with your rags, you will soon become quite plain, said the mother named Jenna. Maria stopped, looked towards the forest, where their small science center was located. Then she sighed and headed back home. There was indeed only her plate on the table. Helen sat down at the table and started eating breakfast like any normal person, despite her reluctance to eat early in the morning. The oatmeal was quite tasty. There was some sliced sausage and cheese on a saucer next to it. Maria's gaze fell on the container in which the mist wheat was growing. Because of her experiments, this plant was often present in her house. The girl noticed that its stalks were pointing all in one direction as to the sun, to be exact. The girl watched for a few seconds, comparing what she saw with her knowledge. Well, of course, how could I not have guessed sunlight before? My goodness, yes, joyfully, she exclaimed. Thank you, Mom, she cheerfully thanked her mom. On the way out of the fence, Maria was now going to work in high spirits. Today, she had one more chance to perform her experiment. The morning, fresh, but at the same time pleasant warm air gave her a good mood. All around stood lush fields, nebulae, lilies, and clovers. Maria was quite young for her business. She was only 23. However, her passion for biology, and in particular, her irrepressible interest in plants, allowed her to grasp the necessary information very quickly and easily, to memorize the formulas and properties of each individual substance of plant origin. Thanks to her knowledge and skills, Maria was sent, or rather left in her native village, to carry out some secret operations. Maria had no right to tell anyone about it. Everything that happened outside the walls of the laboratory remained top secret. The only person who could be trusted with this was Helen. Helen had only recently settled in the village. She grew up in an orphanage that was located in an urban settlement. And it so happened that she went to the village in search of a quiet life. She met Maria by chance, and it was like this. Helen decided to get a job as a milkmaid on the only dairy farm. What was there? Only it wasn't hers. The cows wouldn't listen to her. She couldn't get milk from them. And once one of these horned animals ran away from the stall, forcing Helen to chase her all over the neighborhood. If it hadn't been for Maria rushing to her lab, there's no telling whether the cow would have been caught at all or not. Maria was carrying some boiled apples in her bag for a skewering, so she scented the cow with that fruit. Oh, thank you. The woman pronounced Helen, which caused some indignation on Maria's part. I mean, she was only 23 at the time. Are you new here? Maria asked. I just arrived yesterday. I was given a house here as an orphan. So I settled here. I thought I'd take care of the cows, fresh air, beauty. And it turns out like this. Helen exclaimed, pointing her hand at the cow, which was crunching its second apple with great appetite. I haven't managed to make friends with anyone here yet. Maria asked her again. Not yet. You are the first, said Helen and smiled. Can you keep secrets? Maria squinted her right eye slightly. I can, she answered shyly. Then I have a job for you, Maria said. She had been thinking about hiring someone to help her for a long time. Helen was the right person for it. 18 years old with no family and no principles, Helen turned out to be a very responsible and persistent employee. Maria could easily rely on her. In addition, Helen herself showed a genuine interest in her work. Thus, Maria and Helen bonded together with one goal in mind. When Maria entered the lab, Helen was already here. She had lost or was preparing the equipment for the upcoming experiments. You are in high spirits today, The girl noticed. Of course I am. After all, today we have another chance to get closer to the cherished discovery. Maria exclaimed. Intrigued, Helen looked at the scientist. Today we are moving to another room, spoke Maria, going to the opposite end of the corridor. But why? Helen did not understand the significance of the change of location. We're going towards the sun, Maria replied, walking across the floor in her sneakers. Helen shrugged and followed her. The room that was at the other end of the hallway turned out to be very sunny indeed. It had large bright windows, a wide table. However, all of it was filled with boxes with various junk. Wow, Helen exclaimed, looking around. I didn't know there was such a bright room here, she said. Help, said Maria, picking up the large and hard bag by the handles. Helen immediately provided help. The two girls started to put things in order. All unnecessary junk, including books, containers, magazines, and more were put out in the hallway. Maria then filled a bucket with water and started to clean everything. Helen also cleaned the windows and windowsill. After a couple hours, the room was ready for business. And now the second part, Maria spoke, raising her index finger up. Tired, Helen kept her eyes on her and afterward went after her again. She didn't ask Maria about her plans. She just did what needed to be done. Soon this office was filled with notebooks, pens, measuring devices, barrels, containers, and more. Helen carried young wheat sprouts on a tray. Maria was holding a microscope, the most important component of their activities. Finally, the office was completely changed and turned into a work area. It was much more comfortable than the one before, and all because it had a large windowsill. 2 convenient tables and shelves, on which by the way, placed various additional devices. Well, let's begin, said Maria, putting on her head a special white cap, which perfectly hid the hair underneath. Where are our sprouts? She asked. Here they are, Helen answered, putting a container of them on the table. Great, she replied, after which she extracted one of them. She stuck a piece of green between the glass and then looked through the microscope. The microorganisms of the plant were alive and behaving quite actively. Maria then pondered for a bit. Then she took a bottle of purple liquid, took out a glass and dropped and between them 1 drop of this substance. Then she put it under the microscope again. At first, nothing happened, but after a few seconds, the microorganisms became interested in the new substance. Not only that, they showed active curiosity about it. Maria pressed her lips together. Helen watched her face. She was tempted to ask, "What is it?" But instead, she waited patiently. When would Maria say something? The corners of her lips turned upward. "I think we're getting somewhere," she said. Finally, exactly. "You couldn't help yourself," she exclaimed. What did they eat? They too were eager to look into the microcosm. Maria stepped aside and let Helen see what was happening with her own eyes. The chlorophyll cells began to grow and multiply much faster. Unbelievable. She stretched and then looked at Maria. She was nodding her head wide and slightly, wildly bulging her eyes. While there were only 2 people in the room in complete silence, there was real life going on between the glasses, namely the single-celled microorganisms that lived in the plant cells had completely absorbed the violet substance. It made them bigger, stronger, and tougher. Their lifespan increased. Now that the microorganisms had become more adapted to the artificial habitat, it was possible to move on to the second part of the experiment. But for that, they had to wait for the head office to send the necessary biomaterials. After the successful experiment, Maria together with Helen gently lowered their charges into the test tube and placed them in diffused sunlight. Maria then busied herself with filling out the necessary paperwork to record the events that had just occurred. After completing all the necessary formalities, Helen and Maria went to the veterinary station where they worked for all the villagers. None of the villagers had any idea that these 2 young girls were engaged in very important and necessary work. One day, when the working day was coming to an end and all the papers were already filled out, Helen asked her supervisor, Maria, "Don't you want to have a baby? It's just that you're all grown up now." "It's about time," Helen asked her. Maria thoughtfully stretched out her earring in her ear. "I hadn't really thought about it." Yes, besides, you know, the doctors told me that I have a congenital pathology. I can't have kids, and even if I did, I don't think I'd be able to bear them. Maria pinched the right corner of her mouth. Oh, I'm sorry. Helen felt awkward. She didn't want to upset Maria any further. No, don't worry about it, she reassured her. I don't see anything wrong with it. To be honest, I wasn't really worried. It's God's will. That's Maria's answer. I admire you, Helen said. Not every woman can do that, she added. I can't. Maria laughed. I just live my life, and that's all. And what will be there? Let it remain a gift for me, she said. In these words was contained great wisdom with which not everyone can agree with. I'd, on the contrary, dream of having a child, Helen confessed. I've never had a real family of my own. I think that when I give birth to my son or daughter, I will be happy and have a long-awaited complete family. She spoke, and her face lit up with a smile. Maria had a very different opinion on the matter, but she kept it to herself. Friday night was going to be a busy one, because there was a party at the club tonight. Maria was not a fan of such places, but sometimes for a change they still visited one single cafe, which worked here on Fridays and Saturdays. As Maria supposed, there was nothing new here. Why had she come here in the first place? The dim light of the lamp, the bright flashes, the conversations of the people who rested at the tables. All this brought a strange longing to the scientist, who every time she came here, hoped that she could, as well as the others, to unwind and relax. But it did not happen. The girlfriends that sat next to her at the table were chatting about guys and intrigues that swirled around them. All this seemed to Maria boring and uninteresting. Scoring a mug of tea, which she customarily ordered in the cafe, she decided to go outside. Maria's friends didn't even seem to notice her leaving. They were too engrossed in their love adventures, and the evening was warm and windowless. It was already starting to get sniffly. It seemed as if someone big was bringing a huge invisible blanket to the ground, which would soon cover her whole. Maria stepped down the 2 steps that formed the wide porch and walked along the street. The light coolness was soothing and refreshing. There was silence all around, and only a little music from the cafe was heard. The girl thought that perhaps she was not of this world, since she was not interested in what girls of her age should be interested in. Maria was different. Most of all, she was fascinated by experiments, and discovering something new. It inspired the girl and gave a special meaning to her life. A girl? A male, unfamiliar voice sounded. Maria pretended as if she didn't hear him. Would you help me? I'm a little lost. The stranger continued talking, clearly wanting to make acquaintances. We got here somehow, answered Maria. You'll figure it out somehow, she said. Definitely angered the guy with her words. What kind of a person are you? And not compassionate, he declared, slamming the car door. The guy walked after the girl. The gravel, which was used to pave the roads in the summertime to keep them in shape, rattled beneath his feet. Can I keep you company? Asked the guy, but got no answer to his question. Are you always like this? The stranger couldn't help himself. And you are always such a bore, Maria parried. The stranger hummed again and soon got close to the girl. My name is Nick, said the guy. Let me know your name. He looked at Maria, who took a slow step forward. The loose-fitting shorts that she was wearing emphasized her hips very well. A long-sleeved blouse with a belt drew the eye even more to her respectable figure. Maria had no intention of getting to know him. But the guy's insistence, or maybe a reluctance to seem too rude, took its toll. My name is Maria, she answered. Maria repeated. Nick is a very rare name. Do you know what it means? The guy asked. The girl answered nothing. Martian beauty. Nick said that the girl grinned. I've never heard that one before, she said. You may think it's funny, but it's true, Nick said. The couple paused briefly to look into each other's eyes, and then continued walking again. Why did you leave the cafe? He asked again. Every time I go there in the company of friends, I realize that it is not mine. Maria answered. And now, being there again, I felt out of place. Raising her gaze, Maria looked at the huge hills that were set behind the river-green trees that grew on its surface. Turned them into big soft hats, which so much wanted to take in an armful. Do you like mountains? Nick asked, catching her gaze. Yes, I do. They have such scale, such volume. You look at them and feel the endorphins rising inside. Maria smiled. Interesting, you express yourself, Nick remarked. The girl seemed aloof to him. She wasn't like the other girls who were always ready to throw themselves on his neck. That light and interest that he was used to seeing in their eyes was not available to him now. He felt a little hurt by it. What do you do? Nick asked again. I work on a farm, answered Maria with the usual phrase, and you're on a farm? Nick laughed, wanting to jab the girl. She frowned a little, but then decided to ignore his words. What's the big deal? Yes, I work on a farm. I put tummy time. I treat vaccines if necessary, Maria explained. She was not going to tell him the true purpose of her activity. I'm sorry, it's just that you're very pretty. And such girls always tend to go to the city closer to civilization, to work in offices or to find a rich husband as soon as possible, he explained. I see, answered Maria, and continued walking along the road that led to the riverbank. Here stood a small boat, on the sides of which on special boards were oars. Maybe we could go for a ride, Nick suggested. The first thing that came to his mind when he saw the boat. Why not? The girl agreed. Maria loaded herself into the boat. Nick pulled her onto the water and then jumped in, trying to impress her. He began to row the oars very quickly. He wanted the girl to appreciate his strength and skill in handling the boat. But Maria did not seem to realize that he had surprised her in any way. She looked at the water and at the circles that diverged, answered around. There was a pleasant silence and the soft clapping of oars, and the sun recoiled more and more into the water, sinking into the sky, into the darkness of night, at last bestowing upon the observers and the beautiful peach its sunset. You're not from around here? Asked him Maria, not taking his eyes off the black water. That's right. I'm from the city, Nick replied, watching the work of his hands. Finally, he decided to rest a bit and enjoy this little water walk. You came here like everyone else to have fun. Maria looked at him. Yes, Nick replied, meeting her gaze. What's the big deal? It goes against your idea of a guy. Nick is in favor this time. Don't worry about it. You're not in any danger, Maria snapped at him, turning away. Nick continued to watch the girl. Long, thin neck, fragile shoulders, hair gathered up. It all gave her image, grace, and femininity. On the outside, however, Maria was rather closed off and cold. She kept her distance and did not seem to be in the mood for acquaintance, which is more than can be said for friendship. When you are serious, it is even more beautiful, said Nick, continuing to keep his eyes on her. What do you do in your city? The girl asked, ignoring his words. Nick took the oars again and started rowing. I work for a gold mining company. I go on shift for 2 months, then back again, Nick said, watching Maria's reaction. Usually girls, hearing his place of work, immediately showed interest in him. But Maria remained silent. Despite the frequent pauses of silence, Nick liked being in her company, already getting chilly. Shall we go back to the shore? Maria suggested, feeling the chill penetrating deeper and deeper inside her body. But now she was left without an answer. Nick continued to work the oars, pretending not to hear her. Nick headed to the other side of the river. He was the kind of guy who was always used to surprise, to get emotional, or to embarrass people. At times like this, he felt his superiority. He was on top, enjoying the bewildered and begging, and the face of the person he was playing another joke on. The boat docked at the shore of the sun that had almost rolled over the horizon, still casting its last rays on the shore and the rocks that spread in a wide band along the river. Why are we here? Asked Maria, who had no intention of continuing their conversation. We are going for a walk, he answered with a question. Maria silently agreed. She had not yet fully understood what kind of man he was and why he was acting like this. They continued walking slowly, looking at the light, the sunset. At a time like this, everything was turning golden and warm. And how much gold have you already managed to get? Maria asked. She tried to keep up the already weak dialogue. Of course, I have a keen eye. You could even say that it is looking for me, Nick boasted. Maria did not pay much attention to his words. The pair stopped near the place where the rocks were very close to the river's small flecks, traces, and other metal impurities. They glistened in the sun. "Look how interesting," Nick muttered, running his hand over its surface. "And here it is," he added, running his hand into a small depression. In the next second, he had a small round shell in his palm. To be honest, at that moment, Maria couldn't hide her surprise. "What is it?" she asked with genuine curiosity. "Gold." Calmly and without pathos, Nick answered. The guy was 7 years older than Maria, thanks to the fact that he often made new acquaintances. He understood something about girls. He knew how to surprise them and how to make them suffer. "Gold," repeated Maria, taking the shell in her palm. "But how did it get this shape?" Immediately she asked a reasonable question, glancing at Nick, and squinted a little. "You're silly," Nick laughed. "Our jewelers can do a lot of things. It's a present from me," he said, and then added, "Let's go to the boat." There was a clinking of stones. Maria looked at the shell for a while, and then followed Nick. The boat quickly docked on the other shore. Maria only thanked Nick out of courtesy for the ride, and handed him the piece of gold back. "Take it. I can't accept such a gift," she said. "Oh, come on." "I am from the bottom of my heart," said the guy, clenching her fist. At that moment, he looked into Maria's eyes. He wanted to seem sincere and real. Maria smiled then, thanking him once again, went home. Nick didn't bother to offer to escort her. She seemed like a silly girl, but she wasn't easy to charm. Nick gave her a look, then got into his car and drove away. The new work week began with a new assignment and new experiments. Now that they had obtained stronger and more resistant microorganisms that lived in the green juice of wheat, it was necessary to move on to the second part, namely to make the body with the help of chlorophyll to produce more blood cells. But this requires biomaterials, which the head office had not yet sent to the experiment. Maria was being very careful. Helen assisted the young scientist in preparing the necessary equipment. She laid out a list of all the necessary items, checked their working condition, and then turned to Maria. "Maria, everything is ready," pronounced the assistant in the white coat. "Very well," answered the main thing, without distracting from her work. Maria at this time was again doing the operation to create stronger and living green cells. Helen addressed her assistant again when she was done with her business. "Yes." Maria replied. "Helen, do you know who we will have as a human subject in our experiment?" she asked, checking the instruments with alcohol. Then she looked up at the girl and smiled slyly. Alas, Helen stretched out, not even guessing at the possible options. "No, you before you executed her, Maria." "I was surprised to interrogate Ta, is how I did not give my consent." Immediately, she reminded me. "Then reread your employment contract again." Maria smiled and flapped her eyes. "Don't be afraid, it's not dangerous. I would have become a test subject myself, but someone should stay close by to help fix everything just in case." Maria said, "I never thought my life would end." That's how Helen said it. On her face, there was a genuine sadness and disappointment. "Helen, don't collect nonsense. It's not dangerous. Let's go," she ordered. Maria, stepping to the other end of the corridor. The laboratory consisted of 2 rooms and a long corridor. In one room, they worked with plants and conducted experiments. And in the other room, they filled out papers and thought about work plans. "You just need to drink the green juice, that's all. It's no big deal." Maria reassured her, holding out a glass with a liquid chlorine solution. Helen looked at Maria with a beaten cat look. "Drink. You will have to do this for 20 days. We will monitor your condition regularly. Let's get her up to speed." Maria got ready to write something down in a notebook. Helen drank 100 milliliters of juice. Her face looked as if she had been slurping the green slurry beforehand. However, a little later she noticed that the taste was quite pleasant. After 5 minutes, Maria turned to Helen, who was still sitting on the chair, having eliminated her attention inside herself. But as the scientist asked the question, "You?" The one shrugged her shoulders. "Incomprehensible and rather fed up," Helen replied. And then smiled afterward. "That's how we'll write it down. You're good." Maria praised her and started to write in her notebook with a pen. So today was the beginning of their first experiment with human participation in the category of danger. And this experiment was the most non-dangerous, because the chlorophyll that was contained in the juice from the wheat sprouts was quite edible. Maria, together with Helen, only increased the resistance of its microorganisms to sunlight, artificial environment, and hydrochloric acid of the stomach. Meanwhile, Nick paid another visit to his same familiar village. Meeting Maria had not left him indifferent. The girl was definitely of interest to him. However, Nick did not want to admit it to himself. After all, no beauty has not yet managed to capture his heart. Nick in general was quite a contradictory nature. This mixture of squalor and pride, such people's own sense of importance often rises to the skies, and then with a special crack topples to the ground. And then Nick begins to feel an incredible sense of his own insignificance and worthlessness. And that's when they come to the rescue young and silly girls that seeks attention from the male sex. And Nick gives it to them, receiving their hearts in return, and relentlessly and longing for it, while boosting his own self-esteem. Nick was very good-looking, tall, well-built, had a sense of humor, and could hold a conversation. Among other things, the guy was on a good account at the gold mining company. However, in addition to his good qualities, Nick had one not-so-nice trait since he started working in gold mining. He kept getting the impression that girls wanted to prey on him, that they weren't interested in himself as a person. They are interested in the very possibility of potentially having his gold. Yes, it happens when a man doesn't see his own values, when he doesn't know his own strengths and doesn't like himself for nothing. Nick drove his car leisurely in the hope of meeting her, and fate smiled upon him. Maria, along with Helen, was delivering vaccinations to the cattle. Helen would hold the syringe and Maria would administer the injection. But there was no way one of the cows wanted to stand still. She waved her big head around, waving her horns. Her long tail whipped around. The cow was restless, stepping her feet on the ground. And at one point, she was kicked in the leg, on the inside above the knee. "Hey, you stop," said Maria with irritation in her voice. During the whole day, they immunized more than 50 cows. But the last one turned out to be the most harmful and nasty of all the cows available in the village. Not paying attention to the pain of Maria, stuck all the same syringe, but no longer in the tail as all the other animals, but the neck. "All free, horny," pronounced Maria, stepping aside and away from the river into her work clothes. Helen Chagala followed, carrying the veterinary case in her hands. They were returning home. The horn of an automobile sounded. It was Nick thus greeted the girls. Maria waved at him in return. However, a sharp pain at the place where the hoof hit her made her stop. Maria put her hand to the ear of her forehead. It seems that the cow tried, so that with its blow stretched the ligament-piercing, unpleasant pain did not allow to step on the foot. "Oh my." "Upset," said Maria. "We have an ointment in our office. It is just from stretching quickly heals. But it's for animals." Helen offered hesitantly. She certainly wanted to help her boss. "What's wrong?" "I can help," said Nick, who had just arrived. Maria wanted to refuse to help, but Helen beat her to it. "Oh, you're just in time," she fell. Maria stared at Helen with a perplexed look, but could not object, especially since the pain in her leg still prevented her from stepping on it. "Maria, hold on to my hand," said Nick, putting up his palm. The injured girl wanted to cope on her own, but it didn't work. Putting her hand on his palm, she felt his warmth. All three of them reached the car and loaded into it. Nick drove the girls to the vet station and then helped Maria inside. "So this is where you work," pronounced the guy, looking around. Helen at the same time took out an ointment from the cabinet. Maria took the tube and cast a brief glance at the seashell Nick had given her a couple weeks ago. She didn't want him to think she was thinking of him. "How succinct and simple is everything you have here. All the essentials and most effective." "Yes," he said with a little chuckle. "Wow, what do I see?" Nick said, picking up his present. He was pleased. So the girl was thinking of him. Maria held back from looking at him. She applied a thick layer of ointment and remained in the chair, waiting for the product to nourish into her skin. Helen, looking first at Nick, and then back at Maria, realized that she was superfluous here. "Oh, I completely forgot. I need to transfer all the papers to the computer," she mumbled and immediately left. Of course, all the papers were in this office, so Helen just went home. "Did you get it today?" Nick said, looking down at his leg. "Maria, it happens. But it's not a big deal," she said. "Would you like to go for a walk today?" "Oh, sorry, or rather a ride," Nick suggested. Maria looked at him and realized that Nick was very handsome. But in spite of that, she refused. Nick left that day with nothing. The next time the guy came again a week later, Maria. He met the veterinarian's office. She was filling out paperwork on an experiment they were doing with Helen. "What are you doing here? Who let you in?" She asked the question indignantly. "No one did." Myself, with a smile on my face, answered Nick. Maria, having finished writing in the notebook, put the folder in the desk drawer, and Nick felt relaxed. So he was not shy and sat on the chair that stood near the desk. This angered Maria even more. "Don't you think you're too confident?" she asked. "Actually, this is my workplace, and here I say who can and who can't go through," she said in a firm tone. "And if I'm here on business." Nick didn't back down. "What business can you have in a veterinary office?" Maria grinned. "A friend of mine has a horse and it's not feeling well. I came to ask for help," Nick muttered, looking directly into Maria's eyes. The horse asked Maria again, "And where is she?" The girl frowned. "Standing at my friend's place." "I can take you," Nick said in a perfectly calm tone. The next minute, the two went outside and got into the car. Nick was telling the truth. On the other side of the village, a horse really needed help. It turned out that the animal had unsuccessfully jumped over a ditch. To be more precise, the jump had been a good one. But an iron pipe with sharp edges sticking out of the bushes cut her leg below the knee badly. The owner, who was standing next to her, waved his hand in greeting to those approaching. It was as if the horse realized that it was the vet coming. She behaved calmly and waited patiently for the doctor to do what was necessary. Maria infected the wound and applied a quick healing, giving ointment. "So now everything is in order," she pronounced, examining the animal. The wool of hair was dreamy. Strong muscles attracted the eye. "Maybe you should ride the horses." "Your leg seems to be healed already," Nick muttered. Maria loved horses, but due to her busy schedule, she couldn't afford to have such a beautiful animal. When she saw the white beauty, she smiled involuntarily. The horse stood still and looked thoughtfully in her direction. "The horse has already come to you," Nick said, stretching his hand forward as if inviting Maria to come to her. Even though the girl lived in the village, but she had rarely been on horseback. But still, she knew how to behave as on the stairs. Nick helped Maria climb on the horse and then saddled the second stallion. The owner of the horses returned to the porch of his house and sat on one of the steps. Watching the hooves, the horses getting farther and farther away from his buddies. Maria looked ahead. With her side vision, she could see the trees carrying everything back. The horse gently tossed her up and carried her forward. She had to hold on tightly with her legs. The wind mulled over her face, her whole body worked. This walk was a little exciting for Maria, for she had already forgotten what it was like to ride horseback into the wind. The girl wanted to turn around to see if Nick was far away from her, but the guy was to her right at the same moment. Emotions of joy overwhelmed Maria from the inside out. Looking at Nick, she laughed. "Do you have a good eye?" The guy complimented her. "Thank you." Maria thanked him too. At that moment, she forgot all her prejudice against him. She felt light and good at heart. She felt free and strong. The road where the horses were running went into the forest. It was still as wide, so it was easy for the two of them to walk on the same level. Nick slowed his horse down. Following him, White Horse slowed down as well. The road led the men to a small lake. It had a regular and round shape. The water in it was clear and clean. Fish could be seen splashing in the water and teasing the arriving guests. Nick strangely settled down to get the horses drunk. He first led his horse to the lake, and then did the same with the White Horse. Maria at this time watched off to the side, large wiry hands holding the rope. They held it gently, loosely, and yet ready at any second to grasp it firmly. Nick carefully waited until the horses were drunk and then tied them to a tree that grew very close to the lake. Time drew closer to the afternoon sun, gaining its strength. Nick decided to cool off. He took off his t-shirt and threw off his jeans. Without saying a word, the runaway threw himself into the water. The splash flew around. Maria watched in silence. She hadn't expected Nick to do that. Several minutes had passed. The circles on the surface of the water dissolved, leaving behind a smooth surface. But in the middle of the lake, a guy's head appeared. He dived out and immediately swam to the shore. Having got out on the ground, Nick thrust his chest forward and approached the girl. Maria remained in place. The guy looked up and down, as if he wanted to say, "Look how good I am." But Maria did not show him any emotion in response. It was like they were having a fight with their gazes. Who's going to fight over who? However, Nick interrupted this game with one jerk, pulling the girl tightly against him. His damp from the water droplets his body had silenced Anne Maria's robe. She felt the coolness of his body, which in an instant began to be replaced by a huge blazing heat. The girl didn't show it, but she herself wanted to stay in his arms as long as possible. Her gaze stopped on his full lips. Nick froze in place and couldn't take his eyes off the pretty little plump lips. He wanted to taste them. Another second and the magnet worked. Their lips connected. They enjoyed each other for so long. How long was their breath enough? Spontaneous sudden rush and feelings were no longer possible to stop emotions. Something or somewhere deep inside swooped like a gust of wind on the quietest and calmest day. Hands greedily cradled in his body. I wanted to merge into one and dissolve into eternity. These sweet moments would have lasted forever. If it wasn't for the horse, who was worried about something, he stood on his haunches and began to roar. Raz frightened the local birds. Nick looked at the ground and saw a meter-long snake, what crawled a few centimeters from the legs of the horse. The boy reacted, instantly looking around the ground. He found a stick with a double end. Slowly, he squatted down and picked it up. Then, with that richly similar end, he pinned the snake to the ground. Nick carefully pulled out of Maria's mouth. She was bringing her hands to her chest, afraid it would cold-bloodedly sting the guy. Nick confidently and unhurriedly reached out with his other hand and took the snake by the head venomously, he said, looking the snake in the eye. Then he took a sack from his pocket and stuffed it in there tightly, tying it with a rope. Maria marveled at his act, his bravery and courage. "What are you going to do with her?" asked Maria, worried for the snake's life. "Nothing," replied Nick, tying the bag to his menu. "I'll let her out far away from here," said he, putting on jeans and a t-shirt. "Let's go," said Nick. "Get ready to help Maria climb up on the horse." After driving a decent distance from the lake, the young men released the snake and then headed for the owner of the horses. They returned already quite different. Now they were both connected by some invisible force. What makes people think of each other, dream, and long for each other? After that meeting at the lake, Maria's heart towards Nick melted. She stopped looking at him with arrogance and disdain. The girl herself was surprised at herself. After all, before had never been such a thing. All her love and interest was taken away by work. But apparently, everything has its time. And what is written in the heavens must necessarily be realized on earth. Monday morning came. Maria was already at work. She was once again filling out paperwork and preparing the instruments to draw Helen's blood. After all, the scientists were still working on the experiment. Helen entered the office and obediently rolled up the sleeves of her robe and put her right arm up for the blood draw. Maria gave her a small smile and then silently drew the blood. The procedure went very quickly. After examining the material, Maria concluded that its composition had improved, but not by much. All the parameters remained within the normal range, and the hemoglobin only increased by 2%. But Maria, what does the biochemical analysis tell us? Helen inquired about the composition of her native blood. Maria gathered her thoughts. How to tell? A month's intake of the green smoothie has certainly improved your blood composition. However, not as much as we expected, so we can't rejoice yet. Maria, however, looked at Helen's radiant face. You have definitely started to look better. the scientist concluded, moving on to filling out the paperwork again. Really? The girl ran over to the mirror and started examining her skin and blue eyes. A rich cushion of black clearly framed the celestial color as well. Helen smiled to herself and afterward looked at Maria with a sneaky glance. Thank you for the experiment, and I want to say that I wouldn't mind participating in it again. Helen lifted the test tube closer to her. I don't think we'll need any more experiments like this, Maria replied. We need to look for something more effective, she said and sank into a chair, full of thought. She was staring at the wall and didn't seem to see her partner at all. Meanwhile, Helen was contemplating her long hair, gathered in a tight bob on top of her head. A white uniform cap lay in her lap. Maria's face was a little tired, but despite that, it was still beautiful. High, full cheekbones, big round eyes, such expressive features of the face always attracted the eyes of not only the opposite sex, but also girls. But only Maria herself did not realize it. She was completely immersed in her work. It seemed to Helen that even Nick's advances could not distract her from this business for which she was here. Helen looked at Maria and involuntary thoughts began to enter her head. The girl began to compare herself to her. Was she prettier than her younger self? Or maybe more graceful? It was not for nothing that Nick had jinxed her all evening and then asked her to dance. I'm sure he's already realized that Maria is too boring and dry. In love affairs, he needs a girl, more lively, lighter, joyful, airy, like her, Helen. Maria. If we have no more tasks for today, I can go home, Helen asked. Yes, of course, answered Maria, waking up from her thoughts. Helen said goodbye and left the room. Maria got up from her chair, stretched herself out as high as she could, and then began to think about how she could achieve a more effective effect on the human body. Walking down the corridor from office to office, Maria racked her brains and thought of different ways. Finally, she came up with an amazing idea, and it should definitely work. However, Maria came to the conclusion that only she could become a test subject in this case of the solution that came to her mind, lifted her spirits, and inspired her to start working. She took action on her own, namely she tried to isolate a serum from chlorine that could be administered intravenously. The operation turned out to be quite painstaking and complicated. The first time didn't work out at all the second time. Maria mixed up the tubes with Phil's natural chlorine and with what they had already perfected with the violet substance. The third time, however, everything worked out just as Maria had planned. After a few manipulations, a transparent substance formed on the surface of the test tube. This was the necessary serum. Maria carefully collected it in a flask and then injected it into herself at her own risk. At the same time, Maria wrote everything down in her diary. She did not feel any special changes. Her pulse was normal. The blood pressure was also clear. She moved to her desk and went to her home. But finally, at least she came home early today, her mother said. Maria was a short and slender woman with a long red braid. She was very kind and open, as if life had always spoiled her with good people and warded off all sorts of troubles. Yes, early today. After all, the main work is over, Maria replied, walking into the kitchen. Her mother Jenna was serving chicken pilaf on plates. Maria felt very hungry. A whole plate she emptied in seconds. More refills, her mother asked, surprised at her daughter's appetite. Oh, no, Mommy, I think I will refuse, Maria said, patting her stomach. Nick didn't call you? Jenna inquired. Maria stared at her with surprised eyes. What are you looking at? The whole village already knows that you're dating him. She laughed. Maria almost choked on her tea, but held back. She calmly replied, no, he didn't. He's a nice guy. Take a closer look, Jenna said. He's working for gold. You'll live like in chocolate after all, she said and sent a cookie to her mouth. After dinner, Maria went to her room. Such drowsiness came over her. Ducked down on the bed. She fell asleep immediately. The following evening, Maria received a phone call from Nick. He suggested to meet. Maria, having taken another injection of chlorophyll serum at 5 p.m., closed the lab and went to meet him. Nick was waiting for Maria in his car near her work and nearby about. Among the thick cherry trees stood Helen. She was discreetly watching the young people. She knew that Nick had come this evening to visit them in the village and had followed his car. What was her displeasure when she realized that he had not come to see her, but her boss? And after all, back on Saturday at the cafe, Nick had danced with Helen and all evening, and then spent the whole night as well. So what now? Now he's driving a wedge to Marie Janka again. Helen pressed her lips together. An anger unknown to her until now swept over her. She watched as Nick kindly opened Maria's car door and helped her get in. Then they talked a little more about something. Then they exchanged kisses and drove off in an unknown direction. Helen gave the departing car a glance. She walked forward a little and then leaned her back against a trunk. The old birches in her chest were still ringing all the bells. How could she seduce him when he already belonged to her? Asked herself, Helen's eyes couldn't. Hot tears ran down her cheeks. The girl was not going to share Nick with anyone. That already, as she believed, had become her property. Meanwhile, Nick and Maria were driving along the river on a wide road. Then the sewing embankment changed to asphalt. Nick took Maria into town. He had prepared something interesting for the girl, namely a trip to a restaurant. Maria was worried that she did not look appropriate, but Nick helped her to fix the situation. Together, they went to a women's clothing store. Maria was even a little confused and wanted to leave. She was not prepared for such generosity on Nick's part. Maria relaxed. Nick said, "If I brought you here, I was ready for it," Nick added. Comfortably seated on the soft and comfortable couch, the pleasant girl consultant offered Maria several options of dresses to measure each of them, and each sat on Maria, just incredibly beautiful. "Maria, your medical gown has a unique quality." "To hide all your charms," muttered the amazed Nick. Maria shrugged her shoulders in embarrassment. It was not easy for her to withstand such a volume of attention and a man's frank gaze. "I'm embarrassed in front of you. It costs so much," she pronounced. "Relax and be yourself," Nick said and pulled Maria against him. Afterwards, the couple went to a cozy restaurant. The waiter set a gorgeous table. "And on what occasion we have such an interesting pastime?" Maria asked. "Do you need a reason to please your girlfriend?" Nick said like a real Don Juan. There was a clinking of glasses. Ruby liquid spilled over Maria's branches, filling her with pleasant warmth and enveloping her head with soft weightlessness. "I'll be honest with you. I didn't like you very much at first," Maria said. A playful smile appeared on her face. "Did you seem pompous to me?" "Sorry, it's nothing personal," Maria said through laughter. What in jest? Nick, who was not in the least hurt by Maria's words, had plenty of female attention in his life. If he didn't get it here, he would get it elsewhere. Delicious and appetizing dishes were eaten, drinks were drunk. Maria felt the effects of alcohol after a day's work. "Maria, did you turn my head?" Nick started talking. "I don't even know if I can make it 200 kilometers to your village." His eyes lit up with fire. He brought Maria's small hand to his lips and kissed it. "What are you implying?" "Sly?" Maria asked, still in the same playful tone. "I have a cat, and he needs a woman's caress more than ever," said Nick. "And I'm sure that you, as an experienced veterinarian who understands such natty matters, will certainly help my kitten." He put Maria's palm to his cheek. The girl felt his hot face and the way her hand filled with heat. When Nick's car pulled up to his house, it was already completely dark. The two climbed the stairs to the third floor and went inside. There was indeed a black cat of the paddle breed, a dry Scottish cat, waiting for them in the apartment. He was quite friendly and really needed affection and human companionship. Maria immediately took him in her arms. The woolly prankster started reading and making sounds of pleasure. "You two socialize here, and I'll put the tea on," Nick said and went to the kitchen. "Is this as comfortable for you as it is for me? You can take my things." His voice came from the kitchen. There was a large full-length mirror in the hallway. Maria let go of the cat and looked at her reflection. Now that no one could see her, and now that the wine had washed away her over-criticism, she found that she was really very good-looking. Pulling back a dress the color of bitter chocolate, it was only emphasized by her long, graceful neck, clear collarbones, narrow waist and gorgeous hips. Maria raised her gaze to her face. Behind her stood Nick. He was admiring her dimly, and light unobtrusively filled the spacious hallway from the kitchen. Quiet music was coming from down the hall. Nick moved closer to Maria and put his arm around her waist. They swayed together in unison. Maria again wished it could go on indefinitely. The kettle clicked on, which meant that the tea party could begin. Maria did not want to rush things, and so reminded Nick of the kettle that had joined. The guy had to let the object of his adoration out of his hands and went to the kitchen. And the cat was still hanging around his feet, ready to leave puffs from sharp claws. The aroma of black tea filled the space. They sat on the sofa, sipping tea. An easy and casual conversation ensued between them. Nick told about his trips to the watch, about various incidents that had happened to them in the forest and during the gold mining. Do you know that in the middle of the 19th century there was a law on legal gold mining? Asked Maria Nick. Maria shook her head negatively. Nick continued, it was from that moment that private companies began to open, looking for gold mines. Nick sailed off a little tea, then motioned to the girl. There are a lot of interesting things associated with gold in general. For example, there is a metal called Iron Fist. Dan Wolfdan laughed. Maria, just like the name of the area in Asia Minor. Yes, that's where it was found in large quantities, Nick continued. So during the gold rush, many gold and gold seekers sold it instead of gold, and no one could guess it. Nick stretched out his whole body, then enclosed Maria in his arms again. It has the most beautiful shape, a perfectly smooth cube. Can you imagine? Nick told, trying to impress. And it also has an amazing property, he said and looked at Maria. The girl waited with great interest for the continuation of the story, but Nick was in no hurry to share it with her. He decided that there was enough talking for today. Gently he put his arms around her head. He embraced her heated lips. The kiss was so sweet. Passion developed through her body more and more, and her lips became increasingly demanding. Maria drowned in Nick's embrace and was infinitely glad of it. God, how tender he was. The sensation was dizzying, and they could no longer interrupt the dance of love. Waking up early in the morning, Marianne stretched sweetly and pressed herself again against Nick, who was sleeping soundly. She began to trace different patterns on his back with her finger, then nestled her lips against his warm skin. Nick woke up and hugged her. It was the happiest morning of Maria's life, a morning filled with love and tenderness. The girl's gaze fell on the clock. It was time to get ready, because today was a working day. Nick in no way wanted to part with a warm pastel, and therefore Maria had to organize her own return to the village. But it did not upset her in the slightest. She understood that Nick was taking a month's vacation to sleep and gain strength. Closing the door quietly, she went to the bus station. A fine rain was dripping from the sky. The air was fresh and humid. It was even more invigorating to Maria, who felt quite well despite her late night's sleep and early rise. She didn't get to work until 11 o'clock. She passed the house and went straight to the office. Helen was waiting for her in the lab. That's not like you, is it? Maria said, giving Maria a cursory glance. You don't look like a lab employee either. Maria was not in debt. The girls exchanged smiles. Maria put on a white robe, and Helen tried to sneak a closer look at her and find evidence that she had spent the night with Nick. Maria caught her slanted gaze. What are you doing? She asked. Helen could barely hold back from telling her what she really thought. Calmly, she answered nothing. It's just that you're different today. Are you in love? She dared to ask. At that moment, she felt her pulse pounding forcefully in her temples. She was clearly agitated and tried not to show it. Maria took a comb out of her bag and began to run it through her long hair. She was silent for a few seconds, then twisted her hair into a tight bob and looked at Helen again. An interesting light played in Maria's eyes, and a smile lightly touched her lips. Oh, Helen, I don't even know, she replied. My head is shutting down, Maria said, and Helen listened to her, listening to every word. Tell me Maria is Nick. Helen couldn't help herself. Maria shook her head positively when she heard that. Helen had no doubt that Maria had really stolen Nick from her. That was why she hadn't been able to reach him for the past 3 days. His phone had been unavailable the whole time. Helen's face darkened. She felt a heaviness in her chest. She didn't feel like asking anything else. Maria herself, however, kept saying something. She said that it was the first time she had ever been like this, that usually she always remained indifferent to the opposite sex. But here it was different, Maria said. And with these words, she irritated Helen, who had already risen from her chair and started moving stacks of papers from one place to another. She wanted to tell Maria to shut up and not say another word about him. Noticing that the girl had stopped listening to her, Maria kept silent. Taking the experiment diary and a pen, she went to the next room. Here she prepared the serum again and administered the drugs internally herself. At that moment, Helen entered the room. Seeing Maria with a syringe, she realized that her supervisor had already started to act. "What is the day of the experiment?" she asked. "Today is the 3rd. Maria answered, "I don't feel or sense anything yet. Tomorrow morning I will take blood for analysis," Maria said, putting absorbent cotton from a man to the injection site. "They came again today with that dog. Did they ask you?" "I had to make up on the fly the reason for your absence," said Helen. "But you did all the necessary procedures," Maria clarified. "Of course," Helen replied, looking at her principal. She looked at Maria, and Nick, in whose arms she had not lived a short time ago, surfaced in front of her eyes. Inside the girl began to rise jealousy, and along with jealousy and envy that she was better than her. How could she be better? 3 more years and all her beauty will wither and languish like an autumn flower. That's what Helen thought. The working day of the veterinary office passed quite calmly. The visitors who came in received the necessary treatment and were sent home until the next appointment. Maria reflected on her experiment. All she could do, she had done so far. Now patience is needed to wait the prescribed period of 21 days. This is the time when the bone marrow creates a new batch of red blood cells. The girls finished their workday early again. Maria fell off her feet. She retired to her room. Maria fell asleep earlier than usual. The girl's phone vibrated. It was Nick calling. Only Maria didn't hear it because she was sleeping soundly. Without waiting for an answer, Nick disconnected. He went out on the balcony and lit a cigarette. A dense trickle of smoke stretched from the orange light above and was further blown away by the evening wind. The guy was living out his last week in town. On Monday, he'd leave again for another shift. He wanted to see Maria one more time. The girl had caught the guy's eye with her beauty and uncommon intelligence. She seemed to him smart and even too smart. But even for Nick, Maria remained a simple veterinary worker. To speak about her true motives for staying in the village, Maria was not going to. It had been a few days since the last time she had seen Maria. Nick had come to visit her a couple more times. The two of them had a wonderful time together. And then Nick went to the other side of the country to the Republic of Yakutia, where the mining of the precious metal took place. And Maria continued the experience after the first blood test. She found a significant improvement in hemoglobin, increased, the secretory cells became more mobile. This fact surprised Maria a bit because she always thought she was in great shape. Maria then took several samples of her own blood for further experiments. Several facts of interest to Maria needed to be established. For example, did the resistance of red blood cells to various external negative factors increase? Or maybe there are substances that contribute to their death? And all this very much interested the scientist. Maria literally with the head went to work. She began to study a lot of materials, write large texts in her notebook. She put something into the computer, made tables, and wrote down formulas. In the breaks of work, she remembered Nick, remembered their hot meetings, and thought about what a winded person she turned out to be. Maria's cell phone rang. It was lying on the edge of the desk closer to Helen. She read the name out of the corner of her eye. It was Nick. Resentment immediately sprang up out of nowhere and slid in. She saw the smile on Maria's face and pressed her lip up. Nick's voice came through the phone. Helen turned into one continuous ear. She tried to catch every word, eagerly listening to what he was saying. Maria glanced at her partner and then stepped out into the hallway. I'm coming tomorrow, Maria, said Nick. Are you glad? He asked like a boy. Of course, Maria replied. Afterwards, she felt a strange nausea. She thought it was from excitement. But why would she be nervous? After making an appointment, Maria hung up the phone, opening the door to the office. She was confronted by Helen, who was standing quite close to the door. What are you doing? Maria asked, but what Helen answered her she let pass her ears. Nausea had set in. Maria poured herself a glass of water and took a few sips. It felt a little better, but the next minute the girl rushed to the restroom. Maria, are you feeling ill? Asked Helen when she returned to the workplace. I need to take a blood test. I've been studying another subject lately, and I've stopped watching my vitals, Maria replied. She lowered herself down on the chair. How long have you been taking the injection? Helen asked. About 4 weeks now, replied Maria. She slid down a little on the seat. A heaviness settled in her body. I wanted to lie down immediately. Didn't you overdo the experiment? The assistant asked cautiously. I didn't notice anything bad. Maybe the drug has a cumulative effect, Maria suggested. They decided to leave the blood sampling until the next morning. In the meantime, the girls cleaned the offices, closed the laboratory, and went home. Maria had dinner, and a little sleep began to feel much better. When Nick came to pick her up, she felt a burst of energy and an elevated mood. Maria herself was surprised at her body's new abilities. Nick met Maria with a huge bouquet of flowers. He was glowing with joy, his beloved again in front of him. Hello, my girl, Nick said, pulling the girl close to him. Afterward, he helped her into the car. The couple headed into town. First, they had a delicious dinner in a restaurant, then went to the movies, and then arrived at Nick's apartment. Maria was greeted by the same fluffy black cat. He kept growling to him, as if he was more happy to see Maria than his master. The romantic evening changed to a night of love, and everything was so magical and so beautiful. Maria woke up the next morning with a strong feeling of nausea. She became even more anxious. The girl decided that it could be from the experience she was putting on herself. She was met in the hallway by Nick. I heard a noise. What's wrong? Are you not feeling well? He asked. Maria felt a little dizzy. Probably it's not all up to the rash, said the girl, not wanting to reveal the truth. She herself was at a loss as to what it was. Maria had taken a couple days off from hunger at work. Helen called her that day. She inquired about her condition. When she found out that Maria was back with Nick, she could barely contain herself from angrily hanging up the phone. 2 days passed in a pleasant atmosphere in the company of caring Nick. He tried to help in every possible way. He made tea, found an interesting movie. It was then that Maria returned to the village. She went to the laboratory again. On an empty stomach, she took a blood test to find out what state her vitals were in. Suddenly, she really had overdone the injections, and now she was already getting harm rather than benefit from them. But what was her surprise when she found that one of the indicators was clearly above the norm? Maria looked at the numbers and could not believe her eyes. For a minute, she was still in doubt, but then she finally realized where her sudden bouts of malaise were coming from. Maria slumped down in her chair, holding a paper that she could tell she was in the position she was in. She reread the blood counts over and over again, and still thought it was a mistake. At that moment, Helen entered the office. She hadn't expected to see Maria here so early. The early bird Maria had spoken today. She was settling into her chair. As always, she took off her outer clothes and left her white robe. And only after that noticed that Maria was not herself. What is it? Helen asked. Something is wrong with the blood test. Concerned, she asked. Maria was silent for a moment, but then, looking up at Helen, she spoke. I think I'm pregnant. She said it in a half-whisper. Then she poured a glass of water and drained it in a gulp. Helen, on hearing this news, felt momentary disappointment. However, she restrained herself not to give herself away with a sharp, joyful face, began to congratulate the future mother. It's a miracle, she said in the voice of her best friend. How did it happen? It's not Helen, she didn't say. I don't know, interrupted Maria. Her gaze wandered up the stairs, and then she looked at Helen with a sidelong glance, and lifting her shoulders a little, smiled. Helen smiled back at her, even though at that moment she didn't feel like it at all. Does Nick already know? The assistant asked, pretending not to be interested. Maria shook her head negatively. Helen should have said what she needed to tell him, but she remained silent. Is there anyone by appointment today? Maria clarified. No, only Volodin and his dog will come at 17 o'clock for a shot. But I can go to him myself. Yes, to give the injection at home, said Helen. Okay, well, I'll just finish up the forms here. I'll work with the drug for a while, and then I'll go home, Maria replied. Helen waited for her to say something about Nick, but no. Maria didn't say anything else. That evening, Nick visited the village again. On the way, he met a girl in a green skirt and white shirt with a veterinary case in her hands. That was Helen. Hello, beautiful. Nick greeted her with a wide smile. She didn't miss the opportunity to flirt a little with the guy. Yes, and she liked him a lot. But what to say after their next meeting? Helen was all about him. The girl didn't notice how she was immersed in this fake web. He visited us again, she said. He's not slowing down. Maybe he gave me a ride to the end of the village. I need a shot, she asked. Slows down. Nick stopped the car. Why wouldn't he give a pretty girl a ride? Helen sat down next to the driver. At times she glanced at him, hoping he would show interest or pay attention to her. But he was looking at the road. He didn't seem to be interested in Helen at all. That hurt the girl. The car stopped near a wooden house with painted windows. Helen was in no hurry to get out of the car. On the contrary, she began to behave a little differently. Putting her hand on his knee, she turned into an affectionate kitty. You've forgotten all about me. You don't call, you don't write, she said, and her voice flowed like a stream. I don't have time to do anything, Nick answered. Then he turned to Helen to get a better look at her face. White skin, narrow blue eyes, thin lips. All in all, she was quite pretty. But for some reason, she evoked a self-pity that repulsed Nick. Next to her, he felt guilty for not holding back that night. Helen, you are a good, beautiful girl, Nick started to say, trying to justify himself. But I'm not for you, you know, he said. Their faces were at a very close distance from each other. Nick's words, sharp spokes, pierced the girl's chest, but she didn't give up. On the contrary, her words awakened what they called her shadow side. Helen looked at him with a hard, greedy gaze and then believed in his lips. She clung to him with her hands and wouldn't let go. Nick tried to twist away to get rid of her embrace. When he was free, he pushed the girl away from him with force. He got out of the car, walked around her. On the other hand, afterwards opened Helen's door and asked her to get out. He could have thrown her out of the car, of course, but he had to admit that this sudden kiss had given him some pleasure. Helen, as if a brazen lioness, took her time getting out of the car, lingering a bit in front of Nick. He did not look at her. Afterward, she went about her business. Having come to his senses, he started the car again and drove towards Maria. The girl met him with a puzzled look. Nick, however, didn't notice anything. He was used to the girl behaving this way quite often. At first, according to Maria's assumption, they wanted to go for a walk. But at the last moment, Nick remembered about Helen and changed his mind. Maybe we'll stay at your place for a while, and then we'll go to my place in the evening. I've rented a house nearby, by the way, so I can see you more often. So we can take our time, Nick said, putting his arm around Maria's waist. Really, Maria was surprised. She was pleased that Nick had gone to the extra expense for her. Maria's mother showed up in the hallway. She stopped, rubbing her hands together. Why aren't we going through? Are we standing on the threshold? She asked good-naturedly. Maria, did I teach you to treat guests like this? Everyone laughed. Come in. I cooked delicious cutlets with her tastier than a sneak, said Jenna, inviting everyone to the table. Maria's father was home too. All four of them sat down at the table. Nick did not expect at all that today he would meet Maria's parents so easily. The dinner was held in a beautiful atmosphere. The guests ate a delicious meal and praised the hostess. Maria also emptied his plate with great appetite. And you, Nick, what are you doing? I can see from you that you are a serious guy, Maria's father said. I'm on watch and work on gold, Nick answered briefly, putting another portion of salad. Eat up, All fresh from the garden, said Jenna, happy that her dishes were appreciated. Gold is good, it is always appreciated, replied Maria. Laughing a little, Nick had some thoughts. What if they villagers are just waiting to marry off their daughter to rich fools? It occurred to him, but he hurriedly dispelled these bad thoughts, especially because Maria was so beautiful and so sincere next to him. After a hearty dinner, Maria and Nick went for a walk. Summer was coming to an end. It was August 25th. The cherry trees slowly began to yellow and shed their leaves. The sun's rays acquired a rich peach and chain. The couple walked leisurely along the asphalt sidewalk. In some places it was already broken, in some places it was replaced with earth. However, the bushes, acacias, and apple trees planted on the sides of the sidewalk created their own unique landscape. It was pleasant to walk in such a place. I have news for you. Maria started a conversation. They walked, holding hands. Interesting. Nick paused to look at Maria. Her face was mysterious and dimples formed on her cheeks. Come on, tell me about it, Nick said without shadows. I don't know how it happened. Apparently, God did it that way. Maria began to speak. Anyway, we're going to have a baby, the girl said. Nick was stunned. This news fell on him like snow on his head. I just heard you. Are you expecting a baby? He asked again. You and I are going to have a baby, Maria repeated, and her eyes widened even more. Nick was taken aback. Despite his unpreparedness, he saw Maria and expressed his joy about it. He didn't fully understand what it all meant yet. However, he knew for sure that he was not at all ready for this turn in their relationship. It's great, of course, but so unexpectedly, Nick admitted. You were scared, Maria laughed. Did she make Nick feel vulnerable with her question? No. Why would I be afraid? He answered. Maria was always a little ahead of him. She was braver, more open, and knew better than him what she wanted out of life. That's what she touched him, and at the same time kind of drove him on and urged him on. Next to Maria, Nick felt that he needed to move forward. He needed to evolve. Nick really experienced all this with Maria, but at the same time, he was a little confused by the speed with which their relationship was developing, as if someone had already thought of everything for him, and he had to act according to the already prepared scenario. The walk continued as before. Leaves continued to fall from the trees. The sun continued to move westward. After this meeting, Nick became more sensitive towards Maria, more attentive and more caring. I wish, of course, that things were a little different, that you and I could have been a little more carefree. Met each other, Nick said, hugging Maria around the waist. Well, that's the way it has to be, Maria replied. She kissed Nick. After this meeting, Maria began to think about their future life. She thought about getting married and thinking about living together. The next meeting, she shared her desire with Nick. At first, Nick was flattered that a girl like Maria wanted to marry him. But later he began to think more and more that Maria wanted to profit from him. Did Maria deliberately make up the pregnancy story just to get his money? That's what Nick thought. He thought that Maria, like any other country girl, wants to marry a city boy who also works for a gold mining company. Are we in too much of a hurry? Asked Nick a ridiculous question after hearing the wedding proposal. In a hurry? Questioned Maria, are you laughing? And the girl laughed. I wouldn't want the child to be born out of wedlock. Maria explained her position. And besides, did I mean as much to you as your girlfriends in the past? She asked angrily. No, not at all, Nick hastened to comfort her. He couldn't tell her openly about his fears, but he couldn't trust her completely. Back in the city after a week in the village, Nick thought hard. In a matter of months, his life had changed completely. You know, that's the way it is, said Nick, telling about his difficult situation to an old friend. Yes, Maria quickly tired you on all fronts at once, answered Suryo, the stocky, dark-haired guy. They went out on the balcony to smoke. The cloud of smoke dissolved in the evening air. Yes, Nick stretched out. I thought it was just interesting and beautiful. And the girl is spectacular, and most importantly, smart. There is some calculating and thoughtfulness in her, says the groom-to-be and father. What's that? And Maria, faster than you realized what to what. He laughed. What do you think? Will you get married? My friend asked the most important question. I'll try to make her change her mind. To be my wife, Nick said. What was it that he couldn't imagine? He took a deep draught and let out a thick stream of smoke. It hit the wall of street air and stayed there until the wind blew it away. I don't know yet, but it should be plausible. And it's not totally sneaky. It's a shame about the girl, sweetheart, Nick muttered. They both took their last puffs of cigarettes again, but in smoke, and then went back to the apartment. A few days later on the weekend, Nick went again to his same familiar well village. Today, he had to give Maria an answer about their wedding. He didn't want to look like an insecure teenager or a doubting dude in her eyes. But he needed to make her realize for herself that Nick was in no way suitable to be her future husband. What baby? What wedding for me? Nick wondered as he drove up to Maria's house. Stopping outside her gate, he looked in the rearview mirror and grimaced. Looking at his reflection, he tried to make a tired and haggard appearance, such that Marian would realize that something not entirely pleasant was going on. He knocked on the door. Jenna appeared on the threshold. She was pleased to see Nick before she let him into the house. She informed him that Maria was not feeling well and was therefore resting in her room. You know Maria, she didn't sleep very well all night. She doesn't feel well, her mother said. But in the morning she fell asleep and she's still sleeping. I don't know, I should wake her up. On the other hand, I'd like her to sleep. Why don't you have some tea? I baked a cake and then Maria will wake up. Jenna said, inviting him to the table. Thanks for the invitation, but I'll probably come back a little later. In the meantime, take a walk around the area, breathing the air, Nick said through a smile. Jenna didn't bother to talk him down and agreed. Nick returned to the car. He drove away from the house and headed towards the river. Here there were beautiful wooden benches along the bank. It was the locals who had tried to make it nice for themselves. Nick parked the car in a secluded place formed from birch grove. What was 200 meters away from the village buildings? Nick set off for a walk. He walked leisurely, looking at the stones and river sand under his feet. A light breeze was blowing. The clear blue sky was gradually covered with big cumulus clouds that seemed to be about to float by. The lad reached the dense thickets. They were like walls forming a kind of corridor of twigs with green holly leaves. It looked very exotic. Passing through them, Nick found himself near a gazebo. It was also made of wood. The local people were very careful about the place where they lived. Everything everywhere was a fixture. Nick peered into the gazebo and froze in place. Nothing interrupted the silence. And here in this quiet and peaceful corner on a bench, which had been thoughtfully covered with a soft blanket, was Helen. On the table lay her book, and the girl herself was serenely dozing. Apparently, she had been reading and had fallen asleep. Nick became curious and watched her. The picture was quite spicy and mesmerizing. Helen was wearing a white long sundress. She was sleeping in a strange position. Her hips were on her side and her body on her back. The curves of her body riveted Nick's gaze. The deep cleavage and the fabric of her breasts made him want to touch her immediately. The slit at the hemline looked down at her legs, which had a nice shade of tan. Helen's left arm had obviously slipped down to the floor and now hung in a thin whip. I wanted to put her back where she belonged. Nick took a couple steps forward and found himself in the gazebo. Sitting next to Helen, he couldn't take his gaze off her young and tender body. He reached out to return the girl's hand to the bench, but instead he ran his fingers over her skin and slid his hand up her arm. It was definitely silk already. It was giving him a pleasant sensation. At that moment, something took hold of Nick. It was like he was caught on a hook, like he was asleep and defenseless. Helen took all of his attention for herself. Nick touched her shoulder and then her neck. They say there are 3 things in life that you can easily get positive energy and happiness from. One of them is a young girl's body. Nick held his gaze on her for a few more seconds, but then still removed his hand and sent it away. He looked back, about to leave, but at that very moment he felt warmth on his thigh. He turned around and saw Helen. She was staring intently at him, and her matted buttons that followed the cutout were reached, and Nick could see what was normally hidden from view. Helen continued to hold his gaze. Her lips opened slightly. She gleamed them and pulled Nick to her, mesmerized. The boy simply followed her will, pressing himself against her spouse and body. He could no longer control himself. Circumstances sleeping. Maria walked Nick deserted place, secluded gazebo, in which by fate Helen found herself. Everything was developing in such a way that the guy had no chance to resist such a strong temptation. Nick's lips were greedily fitting into Helen's mouth. His fingers clutched her shoulders, her thighs with force. Helen gave herself to Nick wholeheartedly. In this moment she was real, and Nick was real too. They were both consumed by an insane passion in spas, warm and tired. They were breathing heavily as their passion subsided. Helen and Nick were silently adjusting their clothes. Nick suddenly felt regret for what had happened. How weird is that? The forbidden fruit is really so sweet that you can't resist. It seems like you're about to be torn from the inside out if you don't taste it. And when it's already done, your sane mind returns to you, which just managed to get out of the captivity of feelings and the desire to enjoy Nick. Helen pronounced. Her face was Pannon's. She fixed her hair and pinned it up with bobby pins. "Nick, are you leaving?" she asked, seeing that Nick's gaze was heading towards the village. "Len, I don't know what he is. It's kind of crazy," the guy said, running his right hand through his hair, cut almost to nothing. "Are you going to go see her?" The girl asked again. "Len, don't start. You know very well that at this point, Nick was silent. He wasn't really going to marry Maria. I love Maria," Nick said suddenly. Helen listened to him silently. After all, she herself was well aware that what had just happened between them had been done at her will. When Nick came to the gazebo, she was awake, just lying there. However, she had decided to observe him. And so, when Nick was about to leave, she went to the extreme measure of undoing her buttons and exposing her body. She knew well that men found it very hard to resist at times like this. "But if you really loved her, you wouldn't have stayed with me now," Helen objected to him. "Helen, whose fault is it that you are beautiful?" He asked her a question, but he didn't wait for an answer. Having apologized to her, just in case, Nick said goodbye and went out of the gazebo. He walked quickly and without turning around. Getting into his car, Nick pressed on the gas and went not to Maria, as he wanted to do before, but to the cottage that the guy rented for himself, looking straight ahead. He wasn't thinking about anything. Pulling into his yard, he fell asleep right in the car. That's the way it goes. The guy lives on. Igor doesn't know. But when a girl appears in his life, or God forbid, two girls, that's when karma starts to work, as they say. That's when you're tested for strength, for honesty, for endurance. That's when all your weaknesses come to light. Meanwhile, Helen took the book and went back to her house. She was terribly angry and pleased at the same time. She was angry at Nick for treating her like that and not even falling for her generosity in quotes. And happy Helen was happy because on this day Nick had chosen her. Trite, primitive, but how pleasant it is, how it cures your ego, how it raises you in your own eyes. However, Helen was not going to stop there. Such indecent behavior Nick, even if provoked by her own, even more inflamed the girl. New thoughts and plans for further struggle for his love. When Maria awoke, Jenna informed her daughter of Nick's arrival. Maria felt good about herself and therefore dialed Nick's number. The guy answered quickly. An hour later, he was already at her doorstep. "Mom told me. You came over and I was asleep." "Look, you were sleeping like a baby," she told him. Nick listened to the girl with interest and didn't give anything away. "You look very well," Nick said and kissed her on the cheek. Maria was 5 years older than Helen. She was more serious. Next to her, Nick could no longer act like a fool. He felt he needed to match her. They went outside and the clouds that had gathered in the afternoon dissolved. The sky was clear. An orange sunset was burning on the right. Nick, Maria, started the conversation first. "I realize this all happened very quickly, but I'm concerned about our wedding. Are you ready to step into a new life with me?" she asked, laughing. She tried not to put too much pressure on the guy, but she wanted to get an answer as soon as possible. Nick stopped. He looked into Maria's eyes. She was all pure, bright, and in a way it seemed even the naive Nick wanted to tell her the truth, to tell her that he was not ready, that the wedding was not in his plans, that he was not worthy of her and would hardly be a good father. But instead, he said Maria. He repeated her name. "Well, of course I'm ready. I'm happy to be with you, and I'm ready to marry you tomorrow," Nick said, and found himself confused. Now he had already given his consent. The couple continued to walk forward. Maria's eyes were burning. She was filled with happiness and joy. But the same could not be said about Nick. He felt confusion, anxiety, and regret for what had fallen on his head. A large and gray mass of guilt loomed over him for his irresponsible behavior during the outing. Nick and Maria agreed on the date of the wedding, and also on the day when they would apply to the registry office. And afterwards, Nick accompanied Maria to her house and left for his own place. That night, Helen could not sleep in her head. The thought of tying Nick to herself with the help of pregnancy. What if Maria did the same thing? The girl could not wait until morning to go to the store to buy a pregnancy test. The whole week went by as normal. Maria worked together with Helen. Nick was still living in the village, being on vacation. The following Monday, a not-so-pleasant letter arrived from head office. It informed them that their small branch office, their laboratory, would now be located in the town itself, with staff recruited from the head office's internal staff. Maria read the letter to the end. She didn't want to believe it. It couldn't be that a person's fate was decided by one letter. The girl lowered her hand with the sheet. She looked around the room they were working in once. The meaning of her life had been interrupted. What a shame. That was why it was necessary to have backups. "Maria, what happened?" asked Helen, seeing the pale face of the executive. Maria was silent. "What is there in the letter in this you have no face? You should not be worried at all now." Concerned, said Helen, who mentally hoped for another. "They wrote that our base is no longer needed, too costly, inefficient, and unprofitable," explained Maria. And then she took a deep breath and exhaled sharply. "So we are now unemployed, or what?" Helen asked. The first thing that came to her mind. "Well, why we will be paid a salary for 3 months, and then we will, as before, work in the veterinary office," answered Maria from the movie. On the back of the chair, Maria was looking at the wall and thinking about something. Helen also stopped going through the papers and stared into the void. However, it didn't last long. An unpleasant emptiness in her stomach forced Maria to take out a yogurt from her bag. Helen remembered Maria's position. "Maria, I'm sorry to ask about something personal, but Nick knows about the pregnancy." Helen dared to ask. "He knows," Maria replied, realizing that soon the village would be talking. "It's a pity that the child will be born without the father's surname," Helen said, deliberately wanting to hurt Maria. "For some reason it is. On the contrary, Nick and I decided to get married," answered Maria. That spoiled her morning. For a couple of seconds, Helen was in a stupor. She swallowed the news with difficulty. When she came to her senses, she put a smile on her face. She did. "Congratulations, that's so great," Helen said, trying to hide her indignation. "Yes, Nick is a very responsible and caring man. I'm sure that in a family he will reveal his qualities of a father and a husband even more," answered Maria. At that moment, her face lit up with light. "Yes," Helen replied, nodding her head. "I'm sure his love will be enough for more than one person." She said, "What do you mean?" "I didn't understand, Maria, her statement not only on you, but also on your children." Helen squeezed herself out. The bell rang, signifying that a patient had arrived. The girls went to the waiting room. It was a neighbor. He had brought his pet dog with him. The veterinarians got to work. Already close to evening, Maria entered the laboratory again. She looked at the preparations, the instruments, the flasks, and the wheat sprouts. It turns out that now all this is absolutely useless. How could it be? However, Maria could not leave this case. After all, she did it not only because she was paid for it. She herself was very interesting to conduct experiments and tests, to study something, to discover new things, to watch and puzzle over how to arrange this or that result. And we went into the devices. Maria Yu took her study and then went home. The next morning, she had her blood drawn again. The readings were slightly below normal. The scientists wrote it off as pregnancy, so she didn't pay much attention to it. The next month passed in business and in preparation for the wedding. Maria's mother was preparing the menu and guest list. A toastmaster was also cast, who had an incredible ability to amuse the guests. Maria traveled to the city to pick out a wedding dress. At times, Maria thought that the laboratory was closed just in time, because there was almost no time left for everything at once. However, she still continued to grow wheat and keep track of the microorganisms that lived in the chlorophyll and fed on purple substances. To improve her qualities, once Maria didn't feel well at all. It was a normal working day. It was October. Maria was delivering inoculations to livestock. She felt quite well. However, after lunch, on her way back from the farm, where she was delivering vaccines to local cows and goats, she felt slightly sick. The girl wrote it off as hunger. However, after a short time, she realized that her eyes were getting darker and the ground was getting out from under her feet. One more second, and the girl would find herself lying on the ground. And only Ivan, who was returning with her to the office to buy pills for his household, managed to catch Maria's body, putting a bag under the girl's head. He immediately called an ambulance. The paramedics arrived and wanted to put her on a stretcher. But at that moment, Maria came to her senses and flatly refused to go with them to the hospital department. However, Ivan insisted. "Maria, in your position is not proper to exercise." He said he inclined the girl to go with the nurses. And Maria agreed. "All right, just for your peace of mind," she said in a weak voice. Maria realized that there was nothing to worry about. It was only temporary. She just needed to eat and rest a little. But the doctors who took the tests gave the girl disappointing results. A doctor from the local hospital has approached her. "Based on the data, I would strongly recommend you to be examined at the city hospital. Some points worry and excite me," she added. "As someone who works in a related field, do you know what I mean?" Maria nodded her head, but did not panic. The wedding day came, one of the most exciting days in every girl's life. Her friends were helping the bride-to-be to arrange her hair. One of them used to work as a hairdresser in the city. Obedient curls were evenly arranged in curls, framing the face in waves. Then her friend took half of her hair and fixed it at the top of her head. It looked pretty nice. And then she let out a couple of strands on the sides of Maria's face, finished with a hairstyle and decorated it with an abbot with a small crown. Maria looked at herself in the mirror. She definitely liked her reflection in the bride's attire in the photo white dress and on her head. She looked like a magical fairy hiding in the long sleeves of her dress, and endless love and kindness. Meanwhile, Nick was still contemplating how he could avoid getting married tomorrow. He could not tell Maria directly to her face about his unwillingness to become a husband, so he was still tormented by it and suffered. At the appointed time, the guests and the protagonists of the wedding arrived at the registry office. Being people of little faith, they decided to name the church the marriage palace that was in the village, that looked very, very modest. It looked more like a big hut with wooden walls and roof. In the hall gathered guests, friends, relatives, as well as parents of the future bride and groom. And here Mordovia drove up, while it arrived father and mother with Maria. Jenna walked into the registry office building. First, Maria helped to get out of the car of his daughter, and then offered her his hand. Maria took him under the elbow. Together, they staggered toward the doors of the registry office. Maria's chest rose up more and more often. Either from excitement or because of her position, she was short of air. The doors opened and a neat foot in white shoes crossed the threshold. There was silence, which was interrupted by the rustling of the guests, who began to rise from their seats, greeting the bride. Maria looked up and saw the registrar of the ceremony and Nick's parents through the half-transparent robe. But there was still no Nick himself. Maria was calm, however. She knew he would come. The clock struck exactly 12. Everyone was gathered. Maria felt her father's hand squeeze her palm a little harder. They looked at each other. A kind smile on Maria's face reassured the girl. But suddenly Maria felt sick to her stomach. The air was suddenly no longer enough. However, Maria did not give any sign, but only asked her father to lift her veil. In her left hand, she held a fan. It was her mother who took care of it. The guests noticed this and watched with interest. A pregnant girl always arouses interest, and even more so a bride's daughter. "Why don't you sit down?" Her father suggested it. "Oh no, Daddy, I feel better already," Maria said. Before her eyes were dark spots, but soon they disappeared, and Maria's condition returned to normal. There were whispers in the hall. Another minute of long waiting, and the doors of the registry office opened. Finally, Nick appeared. A smile involuntarily appeared on Maria's face. However, in the next moment, it was replaced by puzzlement and further confusion. Nick looked rather strange, if not even worse. He was wearing black pants that were clearly not his size, and the white stripe that ran along them gave away their ancient age. The shirt that the groom was wearing was obviously not the first freshness. Perhaps 10 years ago it might have been white, but at present it had a ghastly and gray woolen tint to it. The top 3 buttons had been reached. Nick's look was finished off with a thin colored jacket and dirty scuffed shoes. Maria was shocked at the appearance of her fiancé. While she pondered over it, the registrar proceeded to give her speech. "We are happy to welcome everyone who has gathered here today," she began. However, Maria did not listen to her. Maria's father's appraising gaze swept up and down the groom. Whispers ran through the hall again. Nick turned to him. Maria whispered to him, "What's wrong?" Nick, in response, only smiled strangely and answered nothing. "Why do you look like that?" Maria asked again. "I wanted to tell you," Nick began. The receptionist interrupted him. "So I'm going to ask you to answer my question." A woman with large, bright red lips spoke up. "Excuse me. I need to say something," said Nick, looking at the registrar. Maria's lips quivered in displeasure. Nick turned to the bride. "I have a confession to make." He began looking around at the guests present. Everyone was eagerly waiting for the continuation. "You see, Maria," Nick said what he had thought up in advance. "I didn't tell you I deceived you. I pretended I was different. I tried to make you like me. I wanted you to see me as different." Nick was quiet for a while, successful, confident, rich, able to take responsibility for his family. But Nick looked again at the people present and at Maria's parents. They were silently listening to him without much expression on their faces. "I decided not to lie to you anymore and came here as I really am. This is who I really am. I am a beggar. I want you to realize what you are condemning yourself to." Nick exhaled. Having said that, he had expected Maria to express her indignation, to scandalize, to scream, to cry, to send him away. But she didn't. Didn't happen. Instead of condemning and attacking the negligent groom, Maria looked at him with an understanding and even sympathetic gaze. Nick remained silent, certain that it would all be over now. Maria slapped him and ran out of the registry office. But instead, the bride took his hands. "Nick, listen to me, my darling." Maria began to speak, and Nick stood there mesmerized. Money is the availability of opportunities to move in this material world. Having a high-paying position, the prestige of power, it's all the same thing. And love has nothing to do with it. We come to this material world to understand something more. Something that exists regardless of position and money. And that's why God gave us the ability to love. Maria looked at Nick calmly and evenly. Her eyes were not on could she not be afraid. It was as if she knew and was exactly sure of what she was saying. Nick burst out. The words spoken by his fiancée stunned him. He felt his insignificance and weakness. "Nick, I have met you and I love you, as I know your soul and your heart." Maria breathed evenly at the corner of her mouth. A little went upward. Nick was stunned. He was at a loss for speech, though he needed it now to convince Maria otherwise. But her speech was so strong, so powerful, that Nick agreed with it. Never before had he heard of being loved for nothing. That statement, the realization of it. He was fully armed. I could go on. The registrar intervened, realizing that the time for this couple's ceremony had long since come to an end, and they hadn't even started yet. After the formal speech, the registrar announced that husband and wife could kiss. Helen, who was also invited to the celebration, watched with envy. She was behind the big taste that had turned into a real tree. Maria looked gorgeous, and Nick became a different person when he was around her. It was a shame to Helen that she didn't have the power and skills that Maria used to change the sky with ease. But nothing, Helen thought, bringing her palm down on them from her belly. Soon there will be a holiday on our street too. Helen steadfastly endured the swell of jealousy and anger. No one could notice what was going on inside her. After the official part, everyone went to celebrate the wedding in the only cafe. Only today Maria was glad to be there. Together with Nick, they walked hand in hand, and family and friends followed them, accompanying them with songs and music. The Toastmaster immediately took the evening in her own hands, organized the guests, each gave a task. The invitees engaged Maria with interest in what was going on. Nick turned to his wife in the middle of the evening. "Your words today just jerked me from my eyes. I am amazed at your insight and your strength. What kind of a fool am I?" Nick laughed as he hugged Maria. She hugged him back. She had no idea that just a few hours ago Nick had intended to ruin the wedding. "Oh, I don't feel so good. I guess I'm tired." Maria felt a heaviness settle in her body. Yes, and the nausea was coming in. "I went out for a while," Maria said and got up from the table. "Maria, I'll help you. Give me your hand." Nick offered, but Maria refused. "Don't worry, Nick, it'll pass," she reassured him. "It's gone now." Maria collected Maria and went through the kitchen to a quiet corner to be alone for a while. Nick gave her a look and then pressed his palm to his forehead. "What kind of a fool am I?" rattled around in his head. Suddenly, he felt a warmth on his shoulder. "Maria," he said, thinking it was his wife. But when he looked up, he saw Helen in front of him. "Nick, hi," she said hello to him. She was wearing a beautiful pull-back dress of semi-sheer white fabric. She looked like a bride, too. Nick said hello to her, and as if nothing had happened, continued to drink his orange juice. "I'm so happy for you," she said, looking into his eyes. Then she reached out and ran her hand over his cheek. Nick stayed where he was. "Len, what are you doing?" "Still watching, though. Sit down without thinking," he suggested. Helen sat down in the bride's seat. "What do you think?" "We look good together." She asked about us with an innocent smile. A glance across his face, examining every inch of his skin. "Helen, stop it immediately. Sit back in your seat." Nick tried to calm her down. "I will always love you, just as I will always love you. No one will ever love you. Remember," the girl said, and then stood up and went to her seat. Nick was sweating. He had just almost given himself away. He quickly looked around. No one seemed to notice. Here he ran his gaze over to Maria. She smiled weakly at him. She looked tired and a little haggard. Nick went to meet her. "Maria, it's okay. Can we go home already?" "I think you need to lie down," Nick said, and he was right. When Maria was alone with herself, she thought seriously about the words of the doctor who had once told her a couple of years ago that she would never be able to give birth, and that even if she got pregnant, her weak body would not be able to carry the child. After all, Maria has a broken blood process of creation. All the time she had been maintaining her health with vitamins and special supplements that helped her to be normal. And now that she is not alone and her body needs to work for two, she was getting worse and worse every day. At first, the mother-to-be assumed it was natural. However, dizziness and a feeling of heaviness in the whole body became more and more frequent. But despite her fear of losing the baby or not being able to carry it, Maria held her own. "Nick," Maria answered him. "I guess you're right." The day had been very full and joyful, the wife said, running her hand over Nick's chest. He helped her out of the table. And then the two of them, you could say, left the evening. In fact, the guests took it very well. Everyone around knew that Maria is in a position, and therefore she needs more rest and sleep. After the wedding, Maria and Nick were going to move into his rented house. But after consulting with Maria's parents, they decided that the future mom would stay with her family. Nick took it normally. Time went on as usual. Winter came. The month of November began its days with a lot of white snowflakes, and sprinkled all around the roads, trees, houses, lazy with firewood. Winter bit everyone with its white blanket. Maria's condition was getting worse. The woman took vitamins, regularly visited the doctor, but his conclusions were always disappointing. The body could not cope with the function of the fetus. It is more accurate to say that Maria, with full dedication, nurtures her baby, leaving no resources for herself. The doctor was just throwing up his hands. Unfortunately, we don't yet have the research to tell us what to do. We don't know how to get your body to produce more blood cells, so that both mom and baby get iron, oxygen, nutrients, and other micronutrients on time. Also, a normal metabolism is necessary for a good pregnancy, and without certain proteins, this is impossible, the doctor reported. She then adjusted her thick, plastic-rimmed glasses while pressing her lower lip. It was as if the woman felt guilty that she couldn't do anything to help. A good night's sleep, moderate activity, and taking vitamins. That's all I can tell you. She finished. Maria thanked the doctor and then left the office. Nick was waiting for her in the corridor. They arrived at the hospital together in his car. When he saw Maria's still sad face, he realized that things were not as rosy as they usually were for other pregnant women. "What did the doctor say?" Nick asked, looking at Maria's pale face. The woman was silent for a moment, and then answered, "I'm sorry, Nick, but I'm not ready to talk about it yet. I need to think it over," she muttered, raising her eyes to Nick, which seemed to have sunken inward, making the features of her face, Maria's, even sharper and holier. Maria had lost a lot of weight in the 5 months of her pregnancy. Nick felt guilty that it was because of him that Maria had to suffer and agonize over her ill health. "It could have been different. We'll stop by somewhere else," Nick clarified. "I remember that Maria was going to one of the stores to buy something for expectant mothers." "No, let's go home," answered Maria. She felt again the lingering nausea that hadn't let her go all this time. Maria had already gotten used to her plight. At times, however, it was simply unbearable. Nick drove Maria to her parents' house. The woman apologized for her lack of power and bad mood. "Nick, no offense, but I need to be alone," she muttered as Nick walked her home. "Yes, of course," Nick replied. "The main thing right now is that you feel good. Don't worry about me. When are you going to sleep? Call me back. Okay?" Nick asked. Maria nodded. They exchanged kisses, and afterward Nick left her house. The man walked to the stomping path to the car. Opening the car door, he sat in the driver's seat. His eyes were empty, tiredness and hopelessness read in them. He had seen how difficult it was for Maria to be in this position. But unfortunately, there was nothing that could be done. Things had gone too far. For the last few months, Nick's life had turned into something bland, lean, filled with sadness and unfulfilled expectations. And he had envisioned a completely different life. Nick started the car and slowly drove down the road. There was a void in his mind. The time was about 4 p.m. Nick reached the end of the village and stopped outside a cafe. Today was Friday, one of the rare days when it was open. Without thinking, Nick parked and entered the cafe. There was quiet music playing. The tables were empty, except for one. There was a couple in love sitting there. Nick sat down at a table in an unpopular corner. He was just going to be alone for a few drinks, relax, and then go to his house. The waiter brought Nick his drink that he always ordered here. The man held the glass up to the card and took a couple swigs. The cool drink seemed to help him swallow whatever lump stood in his throat. He looked up from behind the bar. There she sat. Helen sat half-turned. She was wearing a short blue dress that perfectly emphasized her slender silhouette. Her hair was gathered in a high bundle, invented into a braid. Helen looked very statuesque and beautiful. She radiated strength. She was learning about life, which Nick was now sorely lacking. However, he would not repeat past mistakes again. He is now married. He has a family, a wife he loves, and a future child. Helen tilted her head slightly to the right and cast a glance at Nick. The man immediately caught it, and with a pulse that made his pulse pound cleanly. He brought the glass up again and took a sip. How alive it was, the real thing. Nick thought, remembering the lost face of his wife, whom he could in no way help. He lowered his eyes down, trying to get those images out of his head. With his side vision, he saw seductive legs. The girl's thin drop of new fabric gracefully lightened them, making them even more appetizing. "Hello." A woman's voice was heard. The voice was pleasant to the ear. It was calm and velvety. In its intonation, you could hear the game. Nick raised his eyes, and his gaze met Helen's playful and cat-whirled eyes. "How unexpected to see you here, Helen. I figured you'd forgotten about places like this by now." Helen shot a glance, accompanying the words with a flirtatious smile. Nick greeted her back and said nothing more. "You've gotten so serious. Getting married has done you good." Helen sat down next to Nick. "You're still beautiful." Suddenly, Nick said, without expecting it from himself, "Well, why not? I am young, healthy, full of strength and love." Helen said, keeping her gaze on him, "It's winter outside, and you're wearing such thin tights," Nick said, putting his palm on Helen's thigh. Realizing that he had let it go too far, he wanted to pull his hand away, but the warmth that emanated from Helen's body seemed to magnetize him to her. "Aren't you cold?" he asked. "Next to you, I am always warm," answered the affectionate kitty. Then she put her hand on top of his and grabbed it, and tried to pull it away. "I have to go home now," Helen muttered. "I still have to deliver a form for an acquaintance of mine who asked me to pick her up from here. It's already 6 o'clock. She has to go on shift," said Helen. "I'll drive you," Nick offered. Helen hummed and agreed. Nick went out first. After getting dressed, Helen took her uniform from the waiter and left the place. 5 minutes later, the two of them were on their way to the address. After giving the uniform, Nick stopped, and at the river, snow fell from the sky again. Gradually, snowflakes caked the windshield. The car was warm, dim lights were burning, slow and quiet music was playing, creating an atmosphere of some romance and pleasant solitude. "Thank you for helping me deliver my uniform." Helen smiled, getting ready to get out of the car. "Where are you going?" Nick asked a question. "I'm taking the cab into town. It's my friend's birthday today," Helen said, stopping and removing her palm from the door handle. "In a cab?" Nick questioned. "Well, yes, I booked it in advance and later changed the location in the application," casually replied the girl. "Let me take you for free." "I'm free right now anyway," said Nick. The car's engine started and they headed into town. In 40 minutes, they were already at the place. It was a cottage village 20 kilometers from the city. "Who lives here?" Nick asked, looking at the 2-story mansion. "A friend from the orphanage got married successfully," Helen replied, opening the door to the orphanage fence. "Aha," Nick was surprised. "You didn't tell me you grew up in an orphanage. Why didn't you ask?" "I don't need to," Helen answered easily, ringing the bell. A moment later, the door opened. The sounds of music and the murmur of voices burst out of the house. "Helen, hello," exclaimed the girl excitedly. She was tall with a short haircut. In a minute, a man appeared, who was her husband. "How glad I am to see you," she said. "Me too. I never thought we would meet again," Helen answered cheerfully. Nick and Helen went into the house. A large table was set in the dining room where the guests were sitting. The company the guys found themselves in was quite fun and relaxed. The guests were drinking, eating, joking, and congratulating the birthday girl. Nick was even glad to be here. It had been a long time since he had been in an atmosphere of ease and fun. He forgot about his current life, Maria, and the baby. The evening dragged on a little longer as the companies of girls and guys scattered around the mansion. Some were dancing, some were sipping wine by the fireplace, and some still couldn't tear themselves away from the delicious table. Helen called her Maria. "You haven't seen our house yet. You and Nick can take a look at the second floor. The guest rooms are unlocked," she pronounced, winking at Helen. "Let me give you the tour," Maria added, taking Helen's hand. The latter, looking at Nick for Chagall, followed her friend. Nick followed them. The interior was indeed interesting and unusual. It was obvious that the owner had a passion for hunting. In the hallway and in the living room hung stuffed animals of some birds and huge antlers of a deer. The second floor had many lamps from one set, which created unusual and cozy lighting. "My husband made these himself," bragged Maria, pointing to a wall or a long one made of stone. Also hanging on it were candlesticks and large sharp knives with carved handles. "Whoa, cool, he uses those knives a lot," Helen asked, testing the sharpness of one of them. The friend laughed. No, these knives are decorative, she reassured. I see, so the local hares are alive. Helen joked. Nick and Maria laughed. The voice of one of the guests could be heard. Your dog ran out into the garden. I'll be right back, replied Maria, and afterward. After saying goodbye to the guys, went in search of her pet. It was a spaniel with long hair ears. He was very curious and loved to chase the local squirrels. Helen and Nick were left alone. How unusual, isn't it? Helen asked. Yes, you can see that people made the house for themselves, Nick replied. Helen then walked too close to the edge of the second floor. Where could she see the living room? Oops, agate Helen, looking down. What is it? Nick immediately rushed to the rescue. He put his arm around her elbow and with his other arm around her waist. No, it's okay. It's just that I looked down and I got dizzy. I actually have a weak vestibular system and I'm afraid of heights, Helen admitted, explaining her unsteady position. Nick remained in the same position. He didn't want to let Helen out of his arms. I've got you. He spoke in a half-whisper and through a barely perceptible smile. In that moment, Nick felt so light, so relaxed. No sadness, no longing. Helen raised her eyes to him. The dim light gave some mystery. Nick and Helen's lips grew closer and closer. At this moment, Nick wasn't thinking about anything. He wanted to receive love and pleasure. In the last months, Maria, because of her condition, couldn't give him that. And Helen, who was in his arms, became for him a real test and temptation. A little more and their lips touched, then another, and he couldn't stop. So much he wanted to enjoy each other's warmth and tenderness. Nick missed a woman's body, a woman's hands. He ran his hands over her body. Nick then sent back a little to pull himself together. His back bumped into a door. It opened. It was filled with semi-darkness. He held out his hand to Helen, and the girl took it. Silence enveloped both of them. Together, they stepped into the pleasures. The mutual desire to satiate themselves with love was achieved. Nick awoke in the early morning hours. Turning onto his other side, he began to search with his hand for the one he had spent an unforgettable night with. Len held out her name to him. Helen came out of the bathroom. Are you awake? She asked, putting on her dress. Are you leaving already? Asked Nick in a sleepy voice. Looking at Helen, he thought she looked a little slimmer yesterday. Yes, she whispered. I have to go into town on business today. She said, How businesslike are you? Nick said, watching Helen fix her hair. The girl said goodbye to him and walked out the door. Nick felt a strange feeling inside himself, as if Helen was no longer that naive girl who was crazy about him. She has her own things to do, her own goals, her own dreams. After a moment, Nick realized that he was in someone else's house. He jumped up, dressed quickly, and went down the stairs. In the hallway was still Helen. Standing next to her was another man. They were whispering and laughing together about something. Nick felt jealous of the girl. He wanted to interfere in their conversation, but he didn't. Afraid of appearing ridiculous, watching them from around the corner, he saw them walk out the door. Going upstairs again, Nick glanced at the clock. The time was the beginning of 9. Sleep was completely gone. Nick took a shower, got dressed, and drove his car to the village. Meanwhile, Maria was already awake. All night she felt cold, she felt sick. She could not get warm. Feeling hungry, she had a summer breakfast and immediately felt a heaviness in her whole body. Maria returned to bed. Weakness and shivering made her tangle herself in the blanket. She tried to fall asleep, but it didn't work. Her head was busy with thoughts. Whoa, cool, he uses those knives a lot. Helen asked, testing the sharpness of one of them. The friend laughed. No, these knives are decorative, she reassured. I see, so the local hares are alive. Helen joked. Nick and Maria laughed. The voice of one of the guests could be heard. Your dog ran out into the garden. I'll be right back, replied Maria, and afterward. After saying goodbye to the guys, went in search of her pet. It was a spaniel with long hair ears. He was very curious and loved to chase the local squirrels. Helen and Nick were left alone. "How unusual, isn't it?" Helen asked. "Yes, you can see that people made the house for themselves," Nick replied. Helen then walked too close to the edge of the second floor, where could she see the living room. "Oops," agate Helen, looking down. What is it?" Nick immediately rushed to the rescue. He put his arm around her elbow and with his other arm around her waist. No, it's okay. It's just that I looked down and I got dizzy. I actually have a weak vestibular system and I'm afraid of heights," Helen admitted, explaining her unsteady position. Nick remained in the same position. He didn't want to let Helen out of his arms. "I've got you," he spoke in a half-whisper and through a barely perceptible smile. In that moment, Nick felt so light, so relaxed. No sadness, no longing. Helen raised her eyes to him. The dim light gave some mystery. Nick and Helen's lips grew closer and closer. At this moment, Nick wasn't thinking about anything. He wanted to receive love and pleasure. In the last months, Maria, because of her condition, couldn't give him that. And Helen, who was in his arms, became for him a real test and temptation. A little more and their lips touched, then another, and he couldn't stop. So much he wanted to enjoy each other's warmth and tenderness. Nick missed a woman's body, a woman's hands. He ran his hands over her body. Nick then sent back a little to pull himself together. His back bumped into a door. It opened. It was filled with semi-darkness. He held out his hand to Helen, and the girl took it. Silence enveloped both of them. Together, they stepped into the pleasures. The mutual desire to satiate themselves with love was achieved. Nick awoke in the early morning hours. Turning onto his other side, he began to search with his hand for the one he had spent an unforgettable night with. Len held out her name to him. Helen came out of the bathroom. "Are you awake?" she asked, putting on her dress. "Are you leaving already?" asked Nick in a sleepy voice. Looking at Helen, he thought she looked a little slimmer yesterday. "Yes," she whispered. "I have to go into town on business today." She said, "How businesslike are you?" Nick said, watching Helen fix her hair. The girl said goodbye to him and walked out the door. Nick felt a strange feeling inside himself, as if Helen was no longer that naive girl who was crazy about him. She has her own things to do, her own goals, her own dreams. After a moment, Nick realized that he was in someone else's house. He jumped up, dressed quickly, and went down the stairs. In the hallway was still Helen. Standing next to her was another man. They were whispering and laughing together about something. Nick felt jealous of the girl. He wanted to interfere in their conversation, but he didn't. Afraid of appearing ridiculous, watching them from around the corner, he saw them walk out the door. Going upstairs again, Nick glanced at the clock. The time was the beginning of 9. Sleep was completely gone. Nick took a shower, got dressed, and drove his car to the village. Meanwhile, Maria was already awake. All night she felt cold, she felt sick. She could not get warm. Feeling hungry, she had a summer breakfast and immediately felt a heaviness in her whole body. Maria returned to bed. Weakness and shivering made her tangle herself in the blanket. She tried to fall asleep, but it didn't work. Her head was busy with thoughts. The woman thought about her condition and how she could help herself. Then the thought took her back to the laboratory, where she had been conducting experiments a couple of months ago, and she was passionate about it. Even back then, someone needed it. She sighed. Everything comes to an end. A table with different preparations, flasks, a microscope stood before her eyes. Maria thought about the fact that she had never finished her experiment. More precisely, she didn't even know how long it should be conducted to get the desired result. When this thought occurred to Maria, she was immediately revitalized. And indeed, due to recent events, she had completely abandoned what she had started. After getting out of bed, Maria washed and dressed, leaving a note to her mother that she had gone to work. Maria closed the doors and walked down the path. A new snow had fallen overnight and covered her father's path again. Work again. Maria thought to herself. Fresh air filled her lungs and traveled through her body in a pleasant wave. The snow crunched underfoot. The sun's rays made the snow glisten and delighted passersby. Maria entered the laboratory. Everything was the same here as before. The head office, having closed their branch, still hadn't moved the equipment out. Maybe they didn't bother. Or was it easier to leave everything here than to move it? Maria drew her own blood first and analyzed it, getting the necessary vitals. Then she took out a serum of chlorophyll, which was powered by the purple stuff from the cabinet's refrigerator. It was still alive and retained all of its abilities. Maria dialed a Tuque syringe and injected herself internally. Then she opened her diary and wrote down her blood counts, and in another column her sensations. What Maria was doing was dangerous, but it was her last chance. After the manipulation, Maria was sick with a special solution, sprouted wheat, and planted a new batch of seeds. After she finished everything, Maria headed home. On the doorstep, she met Nick. He was standing with a bouquet of roses. The corners of his lips were slightly raised. He obviously wanted to please his wife. "It's good to see you." "Hello," Nick said, handing her the bouquet. "You look different today." Nick realized it from Maria's eyes. Her gaze gave away the interest in plans. Maria herself had already rounded belly. It was hard not to notice it. "Thank you for the roses. It's so nice," Maria replied, accepting the flowers. "Purple is my favorite color." "Let's go inside," Maria suggested. She then opened the door and walked into the fence. Nick followed her, followed by his conscience. He was ashamed of last night. Looking at Maria, he was afraid she would guess everything. "How are things going with your job? You said you were going to talk to your bosses about getting hired again?" Maria asked. After all, Nick had lied to her before, saying that he had been made redundant. Then she started to make tea. Her parents were visiting at the time. "I'm going to call on Monday." Nick muttered, making up an untruth. It didn't work out on Friday. Nick started rubbing his eyes. He was literally squeezing the lie out of himself. Now that he had missiled his wife about his financial situation, he was in no hurry to tell her the whole truth. "Nick, I want you to know that I accept you for whoever you are. I just want you to be a good example for our baby," said Maria, taking a seat at the table. Nick took the woman's hand in his palms. "It's nice to have a reliable rear end," he replied. "How are you feeling?" He changed the topic of conversation. "Better. Thank you." Maria answered briefly. Perhaps it was wrong, but she was not going to involve Nick in such personal matters. She considered herself fully responsible for what was happening to her and her baby. She kept quiet about the vaccine, which she went on to administer. The tea party passed in a friendly atmosphere, and afterwards Nick went back to his house. It was a strange family, but still, it was the best thing in the world. Life continued to go on as usual. Nick continued to pretend that he could not be reinstated to his job, although he himself had taken a 3-month leave of absence. Maria continued an experiment that was now essential only to herself. Every day early in the morning, after arriving at the veterinarian's office, she would go into the lab and inject herself. Then she would check the plants. After each week, she had her blood tested. The readings were stagnant. This was a little frustrating for Maria because she had been taking well for 3 weeks now, and there was no visible result. However, she was pleased that the dizziness became less and strength increased. The woman decided to take her time, calm down, and continue to perform a simple routine. After a month, Maria doubled the dose to double her self-perception and body measurements. She also remembered to write in her diary. The time drew closer to New Year's Eve. The villagers were preparing for the long-awaited winter holiday, putting Christmas trees in the house dressed up with balls, buying gifts for loved ones. Here and Helen went to the city for a gift for Nick. You can judge the girl as much as you want, but in one thing she certainly could not be reproached for her love for Nick. She was absolutely sincere. The day was warm and windowless. The winter sun was spoiling the passersby with its rays. Helen Chagall in a black fur coat with a world collar. Such a gift she had given herself last Christmas. What would she buy this time? The streets of the city glowed with multicolored bulbs and lanterns. Glowing figures of bunnies and reindeer were everywhere. Shop windows tantalized with beautiful outfits and Christmas balls. Helen went into one of the stores. She wanted to please herself with a beautiful dress. She went through her hands and hangers with various interesting outfits. The nice fabric slid under her fingers. Finally, Helen found something that lit a fire in her eyes. Then she walked through a few more departments, bought what she had planned, and after a visit to a cafe, she headed back to the village. Already near her house, she accidentally bumped into Nick. He was just coming from the forest with a small fir tree in his hands. When he saw Helen, he stopped. The girl seemed a little different to him, full of absorbent cotton or something. "Hello, Helen." Nick said hello. He was glad to see her again. Their last meeting had been in a very pleasant atmosphere. "Ah, Nick, hello." In a cheerful voice, Helen replied. She wasn't going to talk to anyone for too long at the moment. She was a little excited to meet Nick, as if she was worried that he might see something. "I've decided to put up a Christmas tree at my place," Nick said, as if he and Helen were old friends. "It's not nice to cut down live Christmas trees," Helen remarked as she walked by. She was in a bit of a hurry. Nick found that Helen's disinterest made him a little uncomfortable. There was a time when he was the center of female attention. Now the two women were busy with their personal lives for most of their time and would only give him time when it was convenient for them. "Do you have an artificial one?" Nick asked. "I bought a neat and nice Christmas tree a long time ago." "So I live. Do not touch," she laughed and turned the corner where her house was. Nick looked at her for a while and then went on his way. Before the new year, the village administration organized a holiday for all the villagers. In the House of Culture, they organized a small performance, first for children and then for adults. The evening ended with tea drinking and socializing at a big table. The villagers were happy to be at such an event. Maria and Nick were also here. And a little late, Helen arrived as well. She thought for a long time about whether to go or not. However, after thinking about it, she decided that there was no better opportunity to show herself in an interesting way in front of a lot of people. Maria and Nick were just sitting at the table. Maria was feeling good. Many people noticed that she was looking much better. Maria did not tell them her secret, although she herself realized what it was about. They were talking passionately about something. Music was playing. Someone was performing on the stage, continuing to entertain the guests. Suddenly, Nick's gaze came upon Helen, who had entered the hall where everyone was gathered. His face changed. He didn't recognize the girl. She had visibly gotten better, prettier, and the dress in which she appeared and had all indecently pulled her away, picking out her belly as well. Nick began to blink frequently, as if he wanted to erase what he was seeing. He didn't immediately realize what was going on, of course. Trying not to give away his curious gaze, he tried not to look in the direction of his mistress. Maria, meanwhile, was watching the scene with fascination. For once she could eat, drink, laugh, have fun, and not suffer from nausea or malaise. She didn't notice Helen. She walked around the tables and sat a couple of meters away from Nick. There were 3 people separating them. Nick was beginning to feel somewhat stiff and awkward. It seemed to him that soon everyone would know everything immediately, and that then the man was still talking to Maria, laughing with her. However, his left eye and ear and so wanted to look away to see the girl once again. Finally, the hostess announced a dance minute. The invitees began to get up from the tables to relax and stretch a little. The guests, who were sitting to the left of Nick, also left the table and went to the center of the room. Nick glanced timidly at Helen. She looked at him, but she didn't say anything to him or show anything on her face. It was as if she wanted to say that nothing had happened between them. Of course, it was to Nick's advantage, but at the same time, he wanted to make sure that everything was normal between them. Soon Maria did too, dancing. She offered Nick to keep her company, but he refused, citing his clumsiness. Maria, this did not upset her in the slightest. On this day, when she was feeling her best, nothing could spoil her mood or interfere with her merriment. Nick waved to Maria, who was stepping over her feet and waving her hands in the air. She smiled and was very happy. Then one of her friends dragged her away with her into the company of other girls. Nick was left alone. The realization that Helen was so close to him kept him uneasy. He wanted to look at her again, but at that moment the girl was in front of him by herself. Nick looked down at her and then stopped his gaze on her stomach. "Len, have you put on weight?" he asked, looking around. The guests were engrossed in the fun. "Yes, it's time," she replied, kind of mysterious. Nick glanced toward Maria again. She was standing in the right corner of the room. She was blocked by the other invitees. "I've never seen that before," he said, obviously surprised at his inattention. "It used to be before, but now it's different," said the girl and sat down on Maria's seat. Helen took a white pear and started to eat it. Nick smiled with one half of his mouth. "I'm pregnant," Helen said. "From you," she added, dumbfounding the guy. Nick froze and, without saying a word, continued to stare at the shared Helen. The girl finished a slice of pear, reached for a couple more. "Pregnant? By me?" repeated Nick. "Repeat." He couldn't believe his ears. "You mean how?" He asked the question how, as all answered the girl, and then stood up and went to the center of the hall. She began to dance and move to the beat of the music. The dress she was wearing showed absolutely everyone that she was in a position. Nick, looking at her, burst in his throat dry. He took a glass of juice and drained it in a volley. The girl danced, not paying attention to anyone around her. She was enjoying herself. Nick didn't know what to think. He comforted himself only with the fact that Helen must be in a position not because of him. The man tried to look into other people's faces to see if they saw the same thing he did. And yes, some turned their eyes to Helen and her round-necked figure. The evening came to an end, but dancing and tired. Maria returned to her seat. "Ah, how good it is to feel full of vigor," she exclaimed, stretching her arms out to her sides. Nick stood up and hugged the woman. He too was glad to see his wife in good spirits, joyful and active. Soon Nick and Maria left the House of Culture. Together, they went to Nick's house at Deneuve's. They gave each other tenderness, affection. In the morning, Maria, without changing her routine, went to the laboratory. Nick was surprised at such an early rise of his beloved. After all, a month ago, it was difficult for her to get up at such an early hour. "I talked to sleepy Nick for a while. I completely forgot to enter the latest data into the database to send to the city veterinary station." She lied, even though Maria was no longer an official employee of the secret laboratory. She didn't want to reveal her experiment anyway. "You are such a hard worker, I can only envy you," Nick said, and then he yawned deeply. "Can't you do it after lunch?" "It's New Year's Eve," he said, hoping to dissuade Maria from going out when the sun wasn't even going to rise. "No, you have to keep to the rules," Maria said. "I very quickly," said the woman, and walked out the door. Nick was left alone. He expressed himself in bed and tried to go back to sleep. At home prevented him from doing so. Maria and Helen came into his head every now and then through his stomach last night, had absolutely thrown him off. He lay on his back and stared at the ceiling. How could it be? Life had returned. How on earth did I get this way? That was the question Nick asked himself, crawling with his head under the pillow. He lay still for a while. Not only had his plan to get married to Maria because of his poor situation failed, but Helen's phone rang. It was an unfamiliar number. Nick replied it was his partner Gold Mining Company. "Hey bro." He greeted him cheerfully as he was alive and well. "I've been missing a lot. When to go to work, do you think we and the team are waiting for you?" He spoke in the cheerful voice of a healthy grown. "Good to hear from you. I'm a little sick. I'm getting some treatment," said Nick, making up an excuse as he went along. Nick was in good standing with the company, but only his quirks and fear that women want to get his wealth made Nick incredibly bad and cowardly man. However, everyone has the right to deal with their fears in the ways they are currently willing to. You must be in love. Come on, his buddy laughed. Tell me you found someone else. Havel questioned him. I don't know yet, Nick answered, trying not to go into details. I'll stay at home for a week, and then I'll go straight away for 3 months, Nick said. Did you leave me any more gold there? Or is it all gone? Nick joked. The buddies talked a little more, laughed, and then said goodbye on a good note. Nick fell on his back again. His head was spinning. He'd gotten himself all messed up. How can he now get out of this tangle to tell all Maria, to say that he got a job, and then that he thought to himself still Helen? He said it out loud. "And to hell with it," he exclaimed. Afterward, he got up and headed for the shower. Nick decided that his personal life was his own business, and that only he can decide who and what will be in it, and who will not. Meanwhile, Maria had her own blood tested again. The indicators pleased the scientists. Hemoglobin increased significantly. A smile appeared on the woman's face. "So everything is going according to plan," she pronounced quietly. Despite the clear benefit of the experiment, Maria did not relax. She needed to find out exactly how chlorine made the body produce blood cells in large numbers. After thinking about it for a while, Maria felt a little sad. She would not be able to clarify this question on her own in the local conditions. Having postponed Dumas for the time being, the woman again engaged in growing wheat sprouts. She again sowed new grains and sicked them with a purple substance. Almost forgetting to leave notes in her diary, she sat down at the work table and described everything in detail on paper. Afterward, she entered the readings into a table. Now that her experiment was a clear success, she had to figure out the best way to report it to the head office. The woman realized that her personal presence would be necessary. Having finished her business, Maria got dressed and then returned to Nick's house. The man by this time had already prepared breakfast for two. He decided to leave all his problems behind and leave his wife out of them. Maria arrived in high spirits, and the aroma of hot breakfast made her feel even more at home and warm. The freshly baked omelette was delicious, and the cheese sandwiches were excellent. After breakfast, the newlyweds headed to the room. Soulful conversations, hugs, warm play. What could be better? Nick looked at Maria and recalled his dark thoughts about Maria surely intending to get her hands on his property. He looked into her kind and full of tenderness and love eyes, and an unprecedented struggle was going on inside him. One part of him said that he was a complete idiot to think of such things, and the other half of him, on the contrary, said that Maria had set it up on purpose to leave him with nothing. She'd had the baby so quickly and cleverly without his knowledge. "What's wrong?" Maria asked him, as if reading his thoughts in his eyes. "Are you upset about something?" she asked. I grinned. Nick. "No, what could I be upset about?" He laughed again, holding Maria a little tighter. "You know what, Maria? I'm very happy that you're going to be the father of our children. Yes, I really am. I don't know who could be more caring and attentive than you," the woman said, and then ran her palm over his newly shaved cheek. "Do you really think so?" Nick doubted her words. He thought she was flattering him. After all, what a caring father he is, if he behaves like that. And again it seemed to him that Maria says all this on purpose to mislead him, so that he believed her that she loves him. Nick was both disgusted by his own thoughts, and at the same time they seemed to him to be the only true ones. The husband and wife stirred in bed some more. Then they watched a movie about sea adventures, and afterwards went for a walk. Nature pleased the villagers with its warmth and white, clean as a sheet of paper, snow that every day without tiring fell from the sky. Even the smoke and soot that fell from the stoves could not stain the snow or make it gray. The snow was soft and fluffy. Maria took it in the palms of her hands and tossed it up. It disintegrated into many small crystals. It glittered in the sun like real diamonds and then fell on Maria and Nick. They laughed and cheered like children. Nick took Maria's hands in his palm. They were cool. Maria, on the other hand, felt Nick's warmth. The hands warmed, giving the received warmth to the whole body. The weather was windy, and therefore the fresh winter air was especially pleasant. Night had fallen, the most magical time for all people. I wanted to believe in magic. I wanted presents and friendly gatherings. They decided to spend Christmas at Maria's parents' house. Nick and Maria put up a Christmas tree, decorated it with balls, candles, and other milk toys. Christmas songs played in the house. Jenna did her best to set a fancy table, with duck and apples cookies in the center of it. Jenna, Maria's mother, was worried that because of the long cooking the house was stuffy, and Maria might feel sick. So she made Maria open the door from time to time to air out the room. When everyone sat down at the table, the time was already approaching 12 o'clock. The hosts and guests of the house were quite hungry. After waiting for the clock to strike exactly 12, everyone began to eat. The food was delicious and appetizing. Maria marveled at her ability to absorb the food. Jenna was happy for her daughter. Finally, her daughter is feeling well. "What joy is this for us?" she said, admiring the mother-to-be. But at that moment, the smile on Maria's face was replaced by tension. She even put aside for a cookie wing. Putting her hands to her stomach, she remained motionless. The others didn't notice it right away, but when they saw Maria's agitated face, they froze in place. They didn't know how to help her. And how could they know what was going on inside? "What is it, daughter? Concerned?" asked Jenna. Nick flashed the thought that her illness had returned again. He looked puzzled at his wife, then at his stomach, and then at his wife again. Finally, Maria looked up, looking at everyone and seeing their tense faces. She exhaled. "It's okay, don't worry. It's just the baby's pushing hard. I guess there's not enough room. It's already against the rib, that's all," Maria said, still stroking her belly. "Why don't you lie down? There's a room over there, or here on the couch," Mother suggested. She exhaled again. Maria seemed to let go. Her face lit up with a smile, and now it's time for presents, Maria exclaimed. Everyone clapped their hands, and then went to the Christmas tree, near which there were colorful boxes with big boughs on top. The first present was opened by Jenna. She got a mixer for kneading dough. Then Maria opened her present and was also satisfied with a set of scarves. Nick received outfits for all the gadgets at once, and Maria received the gold jewelry in the form of a set of chain and earrings, as well as dresses and a scarf. Everyone was satisfied. After January 1, time flowed on its own. Short days and long nights, as if nature specially made it so that in the cold and dark season people slept longer and worked less. Who listens to her? Also, after Christmas, Nick went to work. He couldn't stay in the village all his life. Maria was alone here. She was not bored. Her favorite laboratory always filled her with good mood and interest in life. The woman still continued to inject until the end of her pregnancy. She was not going to give up this business. For all this time, she had already accumulated a sufficient amount of material. However, one question remained open. What exactly does chlorine interact with? What causes blood to be created? Taking a piece of paper and a pen, Maria began to compose a letter of appeal to her head office. In it, she voiced a request for research on their premises and with their professional and state-of-the-art equipment. When Maria was satisfied that the letter of appeal was correct, she typed it into a Word document and then sent it to the head office post office. Then, after making a phone call, she personally contacted her former colleague. "Hello, Minna, hello. It's Maria." "Yes," the woman spoke, a little worried. "I have a small favor to ask of you. Check your email. I sent an email with an offer." "Yeah, okay. Maria listened carefully to what was being said on the other end of the line. "Aha, yes, goodbye." She said the words and hung up. The first step had been taken. Of course, Nina was not very eager to deal with another issue, but it was worth a try. The month of February was coming to an end, and the frost that had been pushing so hard for the last 2 weeks had let go. Now -15 degrees of frost seemed quite a warm temperature. Nick returned home from his shift. He had missed his wife a lot in 2 months. Before going to her house, Nick stopped by a store to buy cigarettes. On his way out of the store, he met Helen. He recognized her immediately. The woman was dressed in a long fur coat and a fur hat. Despite the voluminous clothing, Nick immediately noticed Helen's round belly. Along with this encounter, the thoughts and fear that this could have been his child came back to Nick. However, he was saved by the fact that Helen had made no demands on him and had not said anything about it herself. Nick decided to set the record straight. "Helen, hello," he said. The woman stopped and smiled, and though she wanted to throw herself at his neck, she held herself in check. She greeted him back, waiting for his question. What was written on his face? "Helen, forgive me for this question, but you yourself realize that we have met together and more than once." Helen looked into his eyes. It was as if she knew in advance that Nick would ask her that. "Tell me, is it really true that I got you pregnant?" he asked. I felt a stronger pulse beating in my temples. "I knew you would ask it yourself," Helen said, looking into his eyes. With her hand, she was adjusting the fluffy at the collar of her fur coat. Nick could make out her slender fingers with a flawless manicure. "Well, you're going to answer the question," Nick repeated, unable to wait for an answer. "Yes, Nick, I found your baby under your heart." Stunned Helen dumbfounded him. Nick turned pale. He stood silent, not knowing how to utter a single word. "What do you mean, my baby?" he asked. A stupid question. He kept hoping he'd just heard it. "Don't worry about it. It's Nick. I'm not going to hold you responsible or anything. I don't need it," she said in an affectionate voice. Nick found it very strange. Her answer made him feel lighter and at the same time harder to breathe. The woman, without demanding anything from him, gave him the opportunity to act according to his conscience. "But why? Why didn't you say anything to me before, Helen?" he asked. Next question. Why was Nick dialing only now, when he had already been cleared of all obligations? "You see, Nick, it's not nice to break up a family. I'm not that kind of guy, so live in peace," she said with a smile on her face. "But okay, I gotta go." Helen went up on the porch and disappeared in the doorway of the store. Nick took out a cigarette and lit it immediately. Dense smoke enveloped him. The man silently took a few puffs, then tossed the cigarette butt into a snowdrift, getting into the car. He headed toward Maria's house. The news he had heard was still running through his mind, and a happy Helen stood before his eyes. Maria appeared on the doorstep. She was overjoyed at the arrival of her husband. She wanted to jump on him and fall with him on the sofa, but her tummy did not allow it. So Maria gently put her arms around him and kissed him. "How happy am I to see you," she exclaimed. Her face was radiant. It was obvious that Maria was full of strength. "You look so much better," Nick said, quite sincerely. "What have you been doing here?" "That you are full of energy and spirits." He showed interest. "Oh, I don't know. So many new things have happened, and at the same time nothing," joyfully said Maria, helping to undress her husband. She undid the lock on his down jacket and pulled off his hat and scarf. "Come in quickly. I've just baked 2 pies, one meat, the other with jam." Maria flipped through, taking Nick by the hand. The man was very happy to see her so cordially, and even more pleased to see Maria happy. "Where are the parents?" inquired Nick, pulling out of the bag. "Small presents for both of them." "Oh, presents," Maria said cheerfully. "It's Saturday, and they always go to visit Mom's sister on the weekend," Maria explained, pouring fresh for jam tea into large mugs, with milk or with lemon. The woman asked kindly. "With lemon," replied Nick, not taking his eyes off Maria. What was fussing around the table? "Have you changed? Have you become so active? I can't even recognize the old Maria in you yet," Nick joked. "Oh, really? I'm so glad the father of our children is finally home." Maria is now. Putting a piece of pie on her plate, Nick laughed, and then suddenly thought about it. "I didn't mishear. Did you say babies?" he asked again. "Oh, we're having twins," Maria said. "Take a seat in the chair next to Nick." 2 boys. Having said that, Maria felt a thrill inside her, as if she had revealed a big secret. "Aha." That's all Nick could say. "That's a given." "You are a mother," Nick said, not hiding his great surprise. "How is it so? Is it possible?" asked Nick those questions that first came to his mind. "Turns out, yes," answered Maria, taking his hands in her small, warm palms. Eating a piece of the appetizing and hearty pie Nick picked up, relaxed. The news that he would be the father of 2 children at once no longer seemed so sudden. Time passed. Everyone went about their business and waited for the frost to change to warmth, and for the snow to melt and bare the ground. Maria never received a reply from the laboratory's head office. Having sent the letter once again, it remained, apparently, unread, or not taken seriously. But despite this, Maria still continued to give her injections, enriched with special chlorophyll cells. She believed that it was because of this drug that she felt well and could carry the babies to term. Helen, on the other hand, after quitting the lab, also quit her job at the veterinary clinic. Her explanation was that she was bored of dealing with cows and local dogs. She wanted to develop or even retrain. So before Christmas, she did an accelerated paramedic training course and was now working at the local health clinic. She was a GP's assistant, helping to diagnose and prescribe medication. She liked this job and felt more confident and important here. By early March, Helen's belly was already quite large. At the end of March, the baby was due. The doctors wanted Helen to go on maternity leave, but the woman insisted that she was feeling very well and was therefore perfectly capable of continuing to assist the GP and fill in the paperwork. All the more so because, while in hospital, she was literally under the care of doctors. However, there was one little nuance no one but Helen could have known or guessed, that she wasn't actually pregnant. The whole thing was that Helen had purchased a whole set of belly pads from several silicone in their molds. The girl so cleverly learned to copy the behavior of a pregnant woman that no one had any doubts that it was true. In addition, her ability to easily find contact and get along with colleagues was only a plus for her. It was the end of March. A few days before Nick left for his shift, Maria went into labor. Nick and Maria were at his house. It was a normal day. Maria was busy sowing tomato and cucumber seeds in special containers with soil. She sat at the table and quietly hummed a song that was playing on TV. Then the woman stood up, and a second later she realized that the time had come. The labor had begun. Nick at first became very nervous and panicked. However, a little later he pulled himself together and helped Maria to the car. With shaking hands, he started the car and pressed the pedal. In the hospital, Nick paced the hallway, unable to find a place to sit. And if he sat down on a bench, he immediately got up and started pacing along the walls again. After all, when he had brought his wife in yesterday at lunchtime, he had waited for her for several hours before being told to go home. It was evening, said the desk clerk. "You'd better get home and get some sleep, or your mother will give birth." And powerless needs someone who will be in his right mind and sober memory. Nick sat waiting for another hour. Then he went home. He slept through the night, awakened by a phone call. The person on the other end of the line informed him that he could come to the maternity ward. Finally, when the woman on duty approached him, she asked Nick to sit down, but he refused. In an annoyed voice, but nevertheless trying not to be too nervous, he said, "Yes, talk already." Finally, Nick spoke as if it wasn't him. "Calm down, your wife is fine. She gave birth. Except one baby didn't make it, but she did. I was able to save the other boy, so you have a son. Despite the ambiguous situation, I still congratulate you," said the woman in the white coat. That's how Nick pronounced it, putting a clenched fist to his lips. Unfortunately, it happens like this. "In a few minutes you will be invited to the room," said the nurse and disappeared into another. Painted white-colored doors. When Nick entered the room, Maria was dozing. Hearing a rustle, she opened her eyes. Nick saw tiredness, sadness, and happiness in them at the same time. Despite the loss, she was smiling. "What can you do, if that's the way God ordered it?" she said in a whisper. Nick lowered himself to the floor and kissed her hand. "You're so good," Nick said. "Are you so beautiful?" He tried to cheer up the new mother. Maria smiled weakly and a tear flowed from her left eye. "Don't worry. It is so from emotion," soothed him Maria, pressing her cheek to the pillow. The hot drop blended into the pillowcases. "I'm really glad you're alive and what we have," her son pronounced Nick, and then started kissing her hands, her wrist, her palms again. Maria could barely hold back her tears. She was immensely happy to have a man like Nick by her side. So caring and attentive and sensitive. A week later, Maria was discharged home. Nick proudly held his son in his arms. Together, they traveled home. Now that Maria and Nick became parents, they had more worries. Nick tried his best to help his wife during these last 3 days while he was still on watch. He carried the baby, brought the mother, and cooked meals for the whole family. And when it was time to leave, he made sure Maria had her mother by her side. Nick left for a shift. Maria took care of their son. What about Helen? Helen turned out to be a real trickster. After all, she was the one on shift the day Maria arrived at the maternity hospital. And as night fell, Helen turned her dirty deed. And who would be there in the village to sort it out? And what she did was this. On the day when Maria was in the local maternity hospital, Helen panically thought of what to do with her non-existent belly. The most unbelievable thoughts popped into her head. And one such thought managed to materialize, despite the fact that Maria arrived at the maternity hospital around lunchtime. At 10 o'clock in the evening, she was still unloaded. That same evening, another woman was admitted to the hospital. She was a girl from a neighboring village. Her condition was extremely difficult because the baby had taken a transverse position and did not want to turn around. Helen acted coolly and clearly. An unprecedented indifference rose up inside her. She had always been like that, only she was careful to conceal it. And as you know, every quality of your character wants to express itself. And if you don't give it away out in the right way, it will first lurk, come flail inside you, and will sit there quietly and grow, until it gains so much strength that will allow it to break out. That's what happened to Helen. Unfortunately, she had a hard time in the orphanage. Frequent squabbles and altercations with other children each time accumulated in her huge feelings of resentment, and with it cruelty. Little Helen tried to tell the educators that she was offended, laughed at, her toys were taken away, but it was no use at all. In response to her requests, the girl received only ridicule, and in the worst case, complete indifference. Over time, Helen learned to cope with her pain. How exactly? She simply plunged herself, her body, her soul, and heart into complete indifference. It didn't feel so good and peaceful in this viscous and dense pilly. Helen found her salvation in indifference, and when she had already transformed from a little girl into an adult, Helen stopped feeling that shell. She lived with it, bonded with it. Thanks to her, she had survived and continued to survive. It was now that her beloved Nick had been taken from her, and Helen had used her strong and dark qualities that night. It just so happened that there were hardly any doctors in the maternity ward on a day off, and even at night, only Betty was present. What was left for the part-time doctor on duty for the night? Yes, Helen herself. It was thought that 2 doctors per laboring woman could do quite well. No one expected another woman to arrive that night. So while Betty delivered Maria, Helen monitored the condition of a woman from a neighboring village. Her name was Nina. Helen called the head doctor, but he didn't answer the phone. Today was his legal day off, after leaving hers for a while. Helen went to the room where Maria was lying. The woman was completely exhausted. Her eyes were closed. Betty slipped Helen one of the 2 newborns and set a quick massage. "He's not breathing," she muttered. She was confused, meanwhile, the other infant. Helen felt goosebumps all over her body. Taking the baby from the table, she covered him with a sheet and disappeared into a nearby office. A short time later, she returned with another newborn. Betty looked at it and crossed herself. The child was dead. When Maria regained consciousness, she was told what had happened. Maria was overwhelmed with feelings. They mixed inside her into a lump and stuck in her throat. Maria said something, but no one could hear her. In an instant, her ligaments weakened and her voice became completely silent. The young mother took the baby and put it to her breast. Betty stayed with her, and Helen, meanwhile, returned to the laboring woman from the village. Despite the hard and protracted labor, free from her burden, she was conscious. Helen carried the stranger's infant to her. Without a word, she took him in her arms and held him to her chest. Salty tears ran down her cheeks. "It's not mine, she said. "Why should I have it reread by a woman?" And then looked up at Helen. Her eyes were large and round, reddened as they were, and the whites were filling in the capillaries they caught. The entire cushion of her eye had turned black. "I didn't want this baby. I didn't need him," muttered, she barely audible. I didn't save myself. It's not my thing." She swayed back and forth, with the baby in her arms. "I'll help you." It came out of Helen's mouth. She realized that unknown forces were at her back. "Wait until morning," the paramedic said. And when morning came, Helen saw Nick through the open door, who had come to visit his wife. She wanted to make sure that everything was really going the way it should. and Maria would only have one survivor out of 2 children. And so it did. Helen rubbed her hands together joyfully. It seemed to her that she had gotten both of them properly. And more than that, she now had a child with Nick himself. A couple more days passed. The visiting laboring woman from the village was already feeling pretty well. She was discharged from the hospital and allowed to go home. Helen lied to the duty officer about not feeling well, set off by car with the woman, having conspired with her beforehand. They reached her house and dropped off at the gate with the baby. The car door slammed shut, and the commuters left the village. Helen walked with the baby into the house. She couldn't help but rejoice in her happiness, built on the grief of others. But that was not important to her now. What mattered was that her desperate plan had worked. The next day, Helen left for the city by cab. After being there with the baby all week, she went back. To everyone in the village, it looked like Helen had gone to town specifically to give birth. After her return, everyone was happy to see the young mother, and they were happy that their village was growing. Helen herself, however, did not enjoy her happiness for long. She did not think that small children require so much attention and care. But despite this, the girl coped with her duties very well. After all, this wasn't just any baby. It was the child of her beloved Nick. At the beginning of May, there were favorable and warm days. Everyone tried to get out into the sunshine, breathe the spring air, and walk under the open blue sky. Mothers with children were not an exception. Once on one of these walks and met former colleagues Maria and Helen. Both had strollers. Both were enjoying their maternity leave. What meeting! Helen was the first to speak, noticing Maria. The women equaled each other. And together they walked down a path that was not wide but roomy. It led between fields, entered sparse woods, and then led to the beginning of the village. "Hello, Helen," Maria answered her. "Now you've become a mom," she remarked, looking into the stroller. Both babies were sound asleep. "I heard your sad story," Helen said, referring to the loss of Maria's baby, but did not answer. "That's why I went to the city to give birth," she added. "But that's okay. It's God's will." Helen said, remembering the switch of newborns. "You're the only one raising a baby." "Pardon the question," Maria inquired. "Yes, you know, I always wanted to give birth for myself. That's why I don't worry about my child growing up without a father." "So what if his mom gives him everything?" Allah is molding Helen, adjusting the blanket in the stroller. "Little children are so smart," said Maria, taking a closer look at Helen's son. "Wow, here you are his glasses, his ear has the same birthmark as mine," noticed Maria, sincerely surprised by it. "Oh, it's true," Helen played along, covering her ear with the edge of the blanket. "We grow on the same soil," she joked. Walking to the end of the path, Helen turned toward the house. After saying goodbye to Maria, she entered the wicket. Helen had to admit that this fact scared her a lot. "Maria's eyes are watching it all," said Helen out loud, trying to recapture the image of little Maria in her mind. She was trying to figure out if the two boys looked so much alike at that age. On June 1, Nick came home again from his watch. Before going to the village to see Maria, he went to the bank and deposited a tidy sum of money that he had accumulated on his card for 6 months. Even though Nick had known Maria for a whole year, she had already become his wife and given him a son. He still held in his mind the thought that Maria intended to get material goods from him. What can one say? Every girl dreams of a 3-room apartment in the capital. The meeting with the family was warm and gentle hugs, kisses. Everything was. Nick held his son in his arms with great delight, who had grown a lot in 2 months. One day, Helen and Maria met again on another walk. The girls chatted about motherhood and their growing children. It was not a hot day, so it was quite pleasant to walk in the open air. Sometimes there were light gusts of wind. It ruffled her dress. Helen, what was loose on her? Maria noticed that Helen had gotten back into shape very quickly. "How did you manage to get back into your original shape so quickly?" asked Maria, feeling a little envious of her trim figure. "Oh, where are you sitting?" "Here with the baby, one thing and another," Helen said, not hesitating to lie. "It must be hard," Maria said, feeling sorry for Helen. "You have no family here." Why didn't things work out with the child's father? Maria asked again. Just the father of my child made a choice in favor of another woman who was already pregnant by him. And I found out a little later. That's the whole story. But I don't hold a grudge against him. I am still glad that my child is his, Helen said. There was silence. The sparse singing of birds and the squeak of wheels from Nick interrupted it. You miss him. Maybe he's coming to see you after all. You must have informed him that he has a son. Maria suggested, looking closely at Helen. No, I didn't tell him anything. It's all very complicated, replied Helen, who actually had it on the tip of her tongue. The child's father's name anyway. I think he should know what his name is. Inquired unsuspectingly. Maria Nick. Helen said, feeling the pleasure, anticipating Maria's reaction. She wondered a little. How interesting, she said. Maria also said thoughtfully. Nick, is that your husband? Helen declared, stopping. Maria continued walking, but after taking a couple steps, stopped. Her gaze was directed to the ground. She was silent. Helen watched her avidly. What pleasure was it to see the suffering of those who Helen thought had hurt her? What did you say? Maria interjected. You didn't mishear me. The father of my child and yours is the same person. Helen repeated. Facing Maria, Helen became agitated. She saw the woman's pupils dilate. She saw the shock in them. And at the same time, she saw self-pity. Helen saw Maria weak for the first time. She only now realized that such strong individuals also experience grief and sorrow. Helen felt relieved by this discovery. I'm sorry, what did I have to tell you? About that, Helen added. After a while, I was in love with Nick, and I'm sure he loved me too. Until you came along, Helen said, and her tone got a little lower. What are you saying? This can't be happening. Why are you lying? Asked Maria, who found it hard to believe what Helen was saying. Ask him yourself. I hope he has the guts to tell the truth this time. Helen said, and then turned sharply to the right and disappeared into a thicket of acacia trees. Maria stayed on the road. Everything was mixed up in her head. The baby, who was sleeping peacefully in the stroller, woke up and started crying. Maria took him in her arms, began to rock him, to calm him down. Maria couldn't believe that Nick could really do that to both of them. Maria returned home a half hour early. She didn't go to Nick's house. She wanted to recover a little. She was agitated and couldn't find a place to be. She pondered how to start a conversation with her husband. Maria's mother and daughter came into the room. What's wrong? She asked, seeing her daughter's worried face. What's wrong with Jack? She asked. Her grandson's health. No, Jack is fine, but I can't tell you about it yet. I'm not ready. Maria confessed honestly. After all, it was about her family, her future, and her trust in Nick. Maybe you and Nick are going to move to the city. Jenna suggested. No, Mommy, no. We haven't thought about that yet, replied Maria. All right, then I'll leave it to you for now. In an hour we have lunch. Maria warned her mother in advance, in agreement. Started with her head. It was time for lunch. Nick also sat down at the table, embraced Maria. Not receiving reciprocation from her, he did not understand what happened. Deciding that this is a woman's business, he did not pester with questions. Maria behaved with restraint. She would have liked to talk to Nick in a normal mood, but some insurmountable wall prevented her from doing so. At last, after dinner, the family went to their house. They reached home in complete silence. Already in the evening, Nick dared to ask about his wife's mood again. Maria, what's wrong with you? Finally, the man asked. Better answer me, what's wrong with you? Maria shouted, turning around to face him. You scare me, Nick said. And you and your actions scare me. Maria said, a little quieter. She put her palm to her forehead. There was silence. The sparse singing of birds and the squeak of wheels from Nick interrupted it. You miss him. Maybe he's coming to see you after all. You must have informed him that he has a son. Maria suggested, looking closely at Helen. No, I didn't tell him anything. It's all very complicated, replied Helen, who actually had it on the tip of her tongue. The child's father's name anyway. I think he should know what his name is," inquired unsuspectingly. "Maria Nick," Helen said, feeling the pleasure, anticipating Maria's reaction. She wondered a little. "How interesting," she said. Maria also said thoughtfully, "Nick, is that your husband?" Helen declared, stopping. Maria continued walking, but after taking a couple steps, stopped. Her gaze was directed to the ground. She was silent. Helen watched her avidly. What pleasure was it to see the suffering of those who Helen thought had hurt her? "What did you say?" Maria interjected. "You didn't mishear me. The father of my child and yours is the same person," Helen repeated. Facing Maria, Helen became agitated. She saw the woman's pupils dilate. She saw the shock in them. And at the same time, she saw self-pity. Helen saw Maria weak for the first time. She only now realized that such strong individuals also experience grief and sorrow. Helen felt relieved by this discovery. "I'm sorry, what did I have to tell you?" About that, Helen added, "After a while I was in love with Nick, and I'm sure he loved me too." "Until you came along," Helen said. And her tone got a little lower. "What are you saying? This can't be happening. Why are you lying?" asked Maria, who found it hard to believe what Helen was saying. "Ask him yourself. I hope he has the guts to tell the truth this time," Helen said, and then turned sharply to the right and disappeared into a thicket of acacia trees. Maria stayed on the road. Everything was mixed up in her head. The baby, who was sleeping peacefully in the stroller, woke up and started crying. Maria took him in her arms, began to rock him, to calm him down. Maria couldn't believe that Nick could really do that to both of them. Maria returned home a half hour early. She didn't go to Nick's house. She wanted to recover a little. She was agitated and couldn't find a place to be. She pondered how to start a conversation with her husband. Maria's mother and daughter came into the room. "What's wrong?" she asked, seeing her daughter's worried face. "What's wrong with Jack?" she asked. "Her grandson's health?" "No, Jack is fine, but I can't tell you about it yet. I'm not ready," Maria confessed honestly. After all, it was about her family, her future, and her trust in Nick. "Maybe you and Nick are going to move to the city," Jenna suggested. "No, Mommy, no. We haven't thought about that yet," replied Maria. "All right, then I'll leave it to you for now. In an hour we have lunch," Maria warned her mother in advance. In agreement, started with her head. It was time for lunch. Nick also sat down at the table, embraced Maria. Not receiving reciprocation from her, he did not understand what happened. Deciding that this is a woman's business, he did not pester with questions. Maria behaved with restraint. She would have liked to talk to Nick in a normal mood, but some insurmountable wall prevented her from doing so. At last, after dinner, the family went to their house. They reached home in complete silence. Already in the evening, Nick dared to ask about his wife's mood again. "Maria, what's wrong with you?" Finally, the man asked. "Better answer me, what's wrong with you?" Maria shouted, turning around to face him. "You scare me," Nick said. "And you and your actions scare me," Maria said, a little quieter. She put her palm to her forehead. "I can't get my head around it. How could you do that?" She turned to him. Her eyes filled with tears, but she didn't cry. "What's the matter? Can you tell me in an understandable language?" Nick spoke calmly, trying to remember all his possible offenses. "I never thought that you could do that to me and to another girl. It's horrible." Maria stared at him and couldn't accept it. Finally, it came to Nick what Maria meant. He pressed his lips together and shook his head negatively. He really had nothing to reply to those words. He turned away to the window. What was he feeling at that moment? No one could know. After a few seconds, he approached Maria and tried to hug her. But the woman put her arms out in front of her, unwilling to let Nick close to her. "Don't, Nick. This isn't the time. I can't keep pretending like nothing is going on openly just yet," Maria declared. She was understandable, of course. Not every woman would be able to accept such a thing. "I'm sorry," Nick said. "I'm sorry," Maria only replied and left for the other room. The rest of the evening they did not talk about her. Nick knocked a couple of times in Maria's room with her son, but she did not open the door. Nick realized that now Maria should be given time to think about it. Forgiveness was no longer something he hoped for. He returned to the hall and fell on the couch. It had been a sleepless night. There were no sleepless nights. Then, in the morning, it suddenly dawned on Nick. What if it really wasn't his child? What if Helen gave birth to a completely different man who left her? Is Nick the father of Helen's child or not? This is a question that only DNA will help to sort out. In the morning, Nick met Maria in the kitchen. "How are you?" he asked quietly. "Fine," Maria replied briefly. Nick walked over to his son and took him in his arms. He looked at his father with big blue eyes. "God has marked our son." "A birthmark," Nick said. "Helen's son has exactly the same," Maria remarked, glancing at her husband. He looked at her again. It seems he really has done some bad and ugly things. But he wasn't going to cancel the paternity test. After breakfast, he knocked on Helen's door. She opened it almost immediately. She was surprised to see her former love on her doorstep. "Nick, you asked her instead of saying hello." "Yes, hello, Helen," Nick greeted her. He spoke softly and calmly. In such a delicate matter, there was no need to be nervous or hurried. "Why did you come here? Did you miss your son, or a guilty conscience?" Helen appeared before him. "Helen, I realize that my proposal may sound very strange, but nevertheless, I would like to take a paternity test to make sure that this is my son," Nick said without hesitation. Helen hummed. "Can't you see it that way?" she asked, motioning him over to the baby, who was lying in a cradle on the kitchen sofa. Nick glanced at the baby, either from the fact that Nick was half-tuned to the fact that it was his son, or because to Nick all little babies were the same. He noticed that Jacob was what Helen had named her son. Was very, very much like Vanya. Nick clapped his throat dry. "I understand you as a mother, but it's still better to take tests so that there is no doubt," Nick insisted. Helen stretched lazily and then sat down at the table. She offered Nick some tea, but he declined. "All right, Nick, you'll want it that way. Do you think we should go into town together?" I switched to Delu. "Yes, I'm ready to go right now," Nick said. Helen slyly squinted her eyes and smiled. Afterward, she went to her room to change. Off to the hospital for tests. All three arrived without incident. The young nurse took the necessary materials. "That's it. You can go now. You will be notified about the results in 2 weeks," the nurse said, to make sure everyone understood. She went about her business. "Do you want to hold the baby?" asked Helen when they left the hospital. Nick couldn't say no. After all, a small child in adult matters is not to blame. Nick took Jacob and looked into his eyes. The child scrutinized the unfamiliar uncle, but despite the fact that he was in someone else's hands, the boy did not cry or whimper. "You see, children feel their parents," Helen said. They marveled at the expression on Nick's face. "He really looks a lot like you. The birthmark has been passed on. Only you have it more on the back of the ear, and it is very light, almost imperceptible." "And Elia's is immediately visible," Helen said, playing with the baby's legs. Everyone got home on time. Now it was only necessary to wait. And perhaps Nick still had hope for a good resolution of the case. Maria was still not talking to Nick. She was having a hard time with it. She couldn't let Nick and his shenanigans and irresponsibility get away with it. Nick was trying his best to connect. He tried to help Maria more around the house and paid more attention to her. He even improved his cooking skills, although in the current situation it would hardly help him. The day before Nick left, he received a notification on his phone that the test was ready. He immediately contacted Helen, and they went to town again. As soon as the 2 letters were in their hands, they unfolded them. Within a minute, Helen Dyer's face was flooded with light. She sprawled into a satisfied smile. Raising her eyes sparingly to Nick, she studied his reaction. Nick's reaction, however, was not so joyous. This letter, as well as his confirmation of paternity, sounded to him like a judgment, like a brand of irresponsibility and promiscuity, a liar and a cheat. What a ridiculous and senseless situation Nick had gotten himself into. He had his child in front of him, his son, and yet he didn't feel the joy he usually felt when he was around Jack. What can you do? I admit it's my son, Nick said, and looking at the baby with empty eyes. As it happens, I'm willing to pay you child support. I'll help you as much as I can. He said. That was enough for Helen at first. Nick returned home by burrowing. He was ashamed to tell Maria that he was really the father of Helen's child. Maria met him at the doorstep with her arms crossed. Deep down, even though she had such a skeleton in her closet, she continued to love him. Well, the woman asked. As soon as Nick entered the house, the test confirmed that I am Elijah's father. Nick muttered, lowering his eyes to the floor. At that moment, he hated himself and was ready to fall through the ground. You know, Maria, the thing that upsets me the most about this situation is that Helen is all alone. You know, she's from an orphanage and she's had a tough life. But for some reason, it happens that some man, namely my husband, allows such behavior towards her and towards any other person. Why? Maria wondered. I don't understand how it happened. I wanted to say something else, Nick, but catching the angry look, Maria was silent. Indeed, for a 30-year-old man, the question of how do children come into the world? Children remain a mystery. Maria shook her head. I'm sorry about that, Nick said. But Maria went to her room. The next morning, she did not see her husband off on watch. She was angry with him. Immensely angry and hurt. She didn't want to see him. Moreover, she seriously considered burning all his things and breaking up with him once and for all. How could he do this to me? How could he do this to Helen? God, it's awful. It doesn't fit in my head, and everything under my very nose was mumbling incomprehensibly. And aloud Maria, talking back and forth down the corridor, she was offended. A week went by. Nick called his wife every day, wondering how she was doing, how Jack was doing. Maria talked to him, but not like she used to. But still, she felt that a father also had the right to communicate with his son. In mid-July, Maria decided to call Helen. The woman immediately picked up the phone. They agreed to meet, and before going out, Helen tried her best to cover up the birthmark so that it would not be so conspicuous. Well, hello, friend. Maria greeted her. Now she knew that Helen was seeing Nick behind her back. But what to do? What's past is past. With resentment in your heart, it's a lot harder to live with. Now you know the truth, Helen said. And you know that Nick I loved me. Now, of course, he's more with you. But who knows? She said, walking the familiar route. Maria was surprised at Helen's insolence. At this moment, she didn't seem abandoned or deceived at all. On the contrary, it was as if she wanted to fight and continue the game. Len, I know that all this is hurting you very much and taking a lot of energy. But I want you to know that I intend to maintain a good and friendly relationship with you. I'm not making excuses for anyone. But I wouldn't want to raise my children with a common father either. Maria said that quite openly from the bottom of her heart. I agree with you, Helen replied. After listening to Maria's speech, I also think it is not necessary to become sworn enemies now. Helen said, realizing that she had committed a much more heinous act. Maria's proposal to keep good communication was to her liking. After all, under such conditions, she could be closer to Nick, her favorite man. At the end of July, Helen had an extremely difficult day. For the first time during her maternity leave, she was asked to go to work to replace a nurse. Helen was glad of that. She had already missed working days and wanted to go to work as soon as possible. But there was only one problem. There was no one to leave little Jacob with, and how to go to work under such circumstances, Helen thought. After thinking about it, she remembered about Maria. She would be perfect for the role of a nanny. A day for her baby, Helen called her and explained the situation. Maria, of course, agreed. At this time, she was alone with Jack. Half an hour later, at 10:30, Helen was standing with the baby in her arms on Maria's doorstep. They exchanged pleasantries, and after Helen said goodbye and went to the hospital. Meanwhile, Maria was about to go to the laboratory. All this time, she had not left the study of the case of chlorophyll and its effect on the human body. In particular, she was keeping a close eye on the most important organ. On this day, she was going to secretly take her son's blood for research. then analyze the main blood indicators, and then make the main experiment in her career. After all, until the head office took the equipment, Maria had every opportunity to use them as she saw fit. Having put the sleeping Jacob in the wheelchair and taking her son in her arms, she set off in the direction of the laboratory. She reached it quickly and without any problems. The woman left Jacob in the wheelchair, and Vanya put him in the cradle, which had been standing in the office for a long time. Having given herself another injection, Maria moved on to the next case. The scientist acted calmly and measuredly, taking blood from her son's forearm. She immediately examined it and entered all the necessary numbers into a notebook and table, as she always did. Maria then shifted her gaze to Jacob and then back to Vanya. Wow, how amazingly similar the two boys are, Maria thought. Curiosity began to sort out the woman from the inside. One person for the experiment is good, and 2 blood samples are even better. Maria's mind flashed. She took a new syringe, and she did the same thing with Jacob. Now Maria had 2 materials at once, and that was a great luck. Then the scientist, in the same way, wrote out the main indicators of Ilya's blood, reviewing the results, including her own analysis. The woman came to a stunning conclusion, but so far she just saw similarities in a few factors and didn't give it any definite meaning. Until one second it hit Maria. It can't be, she pronounced worriedly. Then she grabbed a notebook with indicators and began to study them even more closely. Why is it such a coincidence? She questioned, and then she was hit over the head with a hammer. She realized that Jack and Jacob were both her sons. How did she cover her mouth with the palm of her hand? I don't get it. Maybe I'm confused. She ran the test, recompared it to her own, and got the same result. Both babies belonged to the same mother. The woman felt short of breath. She felt sick. She got up from her chair and walked around the office, then opened the window to let in some fresh air. What she had just learned was truly unbelievable. The woman then sat back in her chair and fixed her gaze on the babies. They lay peacefully in their cribs. Warm tears flowed down the mother's cheeks. In front of her lay 2 of her blood and 2 dear little ones. Having calmed down, she decided to act slowly and thoughtfully. The first thing she did was to call Nick and tell him everything. He was shocked. No way, it's a felony. Are you sure about this? He asked his wife again. Yes, Nick, absolutely. And I need your help, she said. And those words sounded to Nick like his forgiveness. Yes, of course, I'll try to fly out today, he said. He didn't have to ask his boss for a long excuse. The man of 50 years quickly entered into his situation and even offered his help. My brother works in law enforcement. He could help me to solve this case as soon as possible, he said in all seriousness. Yeah, I hear you, William. I'll go straight to him if I need anything. Thank you. Once again, he thanked the chief and shook his hand. Nick arrived in the village in the evening. Maria was at her parents' house. She told them everything. At a family meeting, it was decided to talk to Helen personally. There was a phone call. It was Helen. She was apparently going to pick up her so-called son. Maria, hearing Helen's voice, became enraged. She was ready to tear her to pieces. Calm down. Maria, get a hold of yourself. I know you want to beat her up, but we're not going to do that. There are authorities for that, her husband reassured her. Maria nodded her head with her hand on the flask. She narrated from side to side. Yes, you're right. That's it, I'm calm. Calmly said the woman in a quiet voice, although inside her everything was boiling. Acting according to the plan. Good, Nick spoke. The door opened. Helen appeared on the threshold. She met their 2 eyes with a smile, but when she noticed the stony expression on their faces, she immediately became serious. Something has happened to Jacob Nick for some reason. She turned to him. Come on in, have a seat, Nick said, taking Helen by the hand and sitting her down on a chair in the hallway. The woman obediently sat down. She obviously had no idea what the conversation was about to be about. So what happened? Helen asked again, now addressing Maria. What happened is that Jacob is not your son, he is mine, and you knew it. Maria's voice boomed upward, and she nearly slapped Helen in the face. How did you even come up with that? She could barely contain herself. Maria, she. It's over, Nick said, putting his hand on the woman's shoulder. Maria began to fill with tears. You have no right to accuse me of something I didn't do. This is my baby, period, shouted Helen. Maria didn't react. Just admit to yourself that you are not capable of carrying 2 children. Helen was not going to stop. Maria clenched her fists tightly again. The insolence of this girl amazed her. You don't have any proof, and what you did in the lab was nothing. You are no longer an employee of the lab, so all your tests and samples are all lies. Not true, Maria protested. At that moment, Nick did not realize what he was talking about. But the door to the room was ajar and Jenna entered. She looked around at everyone with a confused look. In her hands, she held a sealed envelope. What is it? Maria asked. Just now there was Betty, the paramedic from the hospital. She brought the envelope with the DNA test. She told me everything. There was silence in the room. Maria looked at her with a questioning look. Why would she do that? She was in on it too. She asked loudly. No, on the contrary, Maria's mother hastened to explain. The thing is that night, when Maria was in the maternity hospital, another woman from the neighboring village named Nina arrived there too. She began to tell, glancing at Helen. She looked at her with angry eyes. The position of the fetus in labor was not right. Too much time had passed. So when it was finally born, the baby was already dead. And then, apparently Helen, wanting to get Nick that way, switched the babies of one of the infants. What Maria had given birth to, she had put to that woman, and passed off the dead one as Maria's son. At this point, her voice shook. Jenna took a deep breath and continued. She said that a woman from a neighboring village told her husband that she had given birth to a stillborn, and it was true. He didn't believe her and went with her to the village maternity hospital. And there in the register, there was a note that she had given birth to a healthy and strong boy. Betty, who was on shift at the hospital that night, begged him to sort it out quietly. She didn't want to be out of work in her old age with a story like that. It took a lot of paperwork before the stillbirth records were found. Betty breathed a sigh of relief then. After all, the pages had testified that this boy's DNA matched the DNA of the woman who had given birth in the village. Betty managed to convince the man of that. He went away, and then she wondered if the dead boy was born to that one. Then where is the live and healthy boy Maria? Worried about her future life in the small village, Betty acted alone stealthily, taking baby Elijah Salava and Helen's hair. She sent them to town for research. She did the same with Maria, and this is what she got. Finished. Finally, Jenna held out the envelope to Maria. Maria felt a strong current of blood in her temples. Helen, in the meantime, was already sitting silently and was not going to object. When the envelope was opened, Maria quickly ran her eyes over it. A woman's simultaneous laughter and sobs were heard. Nick pulled her against him. Maria wrapped her arms around him. God. It says here it's my son. My son. Can you believe it? The woman said through her tears. Jenna also ran her palm over her wet eyes. And only Helen alone still felt the coldness and indifference in which she felt so good. Then Nick asked Svetlana to take Maria to another room, and afterwards gave a long lecture. Desperate girls, and the best option for you now, Len, is to get as far away from here as possible. That's my advice to you, in conclusion, muttered Nick. The next morning, Helen was not in the village. The story remained relatively closed. Only a narrow circle of people knew about it. Maria had forgiven Nick, and to be honest, she wasn't going to hold a grudge against him. She felt it was unnecessary. After Ilya's adoption and all the paperwork, Nick went on watch again. After all, no one canceled work. Maria continued to live, enjoying motherhood. However, she did not forget about her interest. One day, unexpectedly for everyone, and first of all for Maria herself, she received the reply from the head office of the laboratory. The letter said that they were quite interested in the experiment Maria had conducted, and that they would like to see the young scientist in their city. Travel and lodging would be paid. Maria was crazy with happiness. Had it really happened? It turns out that everything was not in vain. Maria spent a whole week on a business trip away from her babies. But during this time, she managed to confirm her experiment. Modern equipment made the work much easier, and the fresh minds of the staff suggested a more efficient way of obtaining data. And at the end of the week, the scientists came to the surprising conclusion that chlorine fill is really beneficial to the circulatory system. Penetrating the blood, it gets into the bone marrow, where it begins its main and most important function of the blood of creation. Maria was awarded the Nobel Prize and was also invited to work in the main department of the laboratory. In addition, while Maria was on maternity leave, she was again officially allowed to study plants and their effects on the human body. When Nick returned from work, he was extremely surprised by his wife's abilities, and no less surprised by the fact that all this time she had been doing this work secretly from everyone. The man became embarrassed for what he considered Maria hunting for his wealth. One evening, he approached her and embraced her and said affectionately, "Maria, you are so good. I love you so much. How nice it is when you are accepted not only for your virtues, but also for your shortcomings. Thank you that you are still with me, that you gave me 2 wonderful sons for believing in me, even when I knew I was a beggar," Nick said. "And I realized from the beginning that you don't earn much. You're just blowing dust in your eyes." Maria said, stumping Nick. That's how Nick wanted to know. "Do you remember that golden seashell you gave me?" asked Maria. "Well," nodded the man, "it wasn't gold, but iron. I'm a chemist after all." The woman flicked his hair back. "So you knew I was a nobody from the beginning, but you still wanted to be with me." Nick didn't believe it. "I always told you to follow the way of the heart," Maria pronounced and kissed her husband. At that very moment, Nick realized that he, really on the right path.